A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support. Growing up, Thanksgiving was my favorite holiday. It always meant a table overflowing with food, laughing family members, and the warm scent of pumpkin pie wafting through the air. However, this year was different. My family had grown distant, caught up in life's responsibilities, jobs, and whatever else life threw our way. I was living in a cramped studio apartment, scraping by paycheck to paycheck. So when my sister texted a week before the holiday to say she'd be hosting Thanksgiving, I was filled with a mix of joy and dread. I immediately assumed I'd at least bring dessert or contribute in some way, but when I asked her whether I should pick up a pie, she responded with a strange silence that pinched at my gut. Finally, she texted back, "It's fine, just come," leaving me in a pit of uncertainty. As Thanksgiving approached, I tried my best to prepare mentally. I envisioned my family around the table, laughing over stories from past Thanksgivings, feeling full and happy as I enjoyed their company. Then, I wondered if I could really afford to pitch in this year. I didn't want to seem cheap, but the thought of struggling to make rent mixed with the guilt of not being able to contribute gnawed at me. The evening of Thanksgiving dawned crisp and clear, and I arrived at my sister's house, trying to remember what it felt like for everyone to get together. As I walked through the door, a delicious aroma hit me. The turkey, roasted to perfection, mingled with the sweetness of cranberry sauce and buttery rolls. For a heartbeat, everything felt perfect, and then I noticed something strange. My sister had a pinched smile plastered on her face, and the guests, a mixture of my siblings and their partners, seemed uncharacteristically tense, the clinking of forks muffling the chatter that should have filled the room. I tried to shake off my unease and joined in, eager to dig into the feast. But soon enough, after a few awkward exchanges, my sister announced that a sudden rise in grocery prices this year meant that everyone would need to contribute, which was a strange proclamation considering how we'd always shared the burden as a family. It felt like someone had ripped the joy out of the room. Why did it feel like such a dire situation? I looked around, searching for supportive eyes or someone to break the tension. The shallow laughs only underscored the simmering discontent in my heart. Just as I started to relax, she passed around a collection bowl, glaring at me as if the responsibility to pay for Thanksgiving groceries rested solely on my shoulders. My mind raced, confusion clouding my thoughts. It isn't a potluck if you intend to charge your family to attend. The ambivalence unfolded further as she demanded we each pay an outrageous amount akin to what a meal would cost for a dozen people at a restaurant. I looked at my family's expectant faces. I felt trapped. My heart sank because I would have defended my point without hesitation had this not been my blood. So, I hesitated, caught between the horror of being labeled the cheap sibling and the truth of my situation that left me worrying about bills. Just as I opened my mouth to voice my feelings, a small voice from my youngest niece chimed in, asking why we couldn't all share the joy of spending time together instead of worrying about money. My heart squeezed painfully. I saw my sister's face go pale. I tried to shift the conversation, laughing nervously and sharing a silly story about being trapped in my cramped apartment, but it only felt like digging a deeper hole as my other siblings stared at me in disappointment. I could feel the energy of the room crashing and swirling around me. My pulse quickened, panic began to choke the air. I voiced a quiet AITA for expecting not to have to pay for Thanksgiving groceries. Trying to gauge the atmosphere. Unexpectedly, that innocent prompt lit up tension. "Well, maybe if we all pitched in like we used to, we wouldn't have this problem," my sister snapped, her smile long gone, replaced by a deep flush of anger. Before I could speak, the room erupted into a cacophony of arguments, voices tangled in a familial riot, accusations of selfishness, indifference, and entitlement scraping against each other like metal on metal. I recoiled, panic clawing its way up my throat as I desperately tried to understand how my innocent gesture had thrown everyone into chaos. I could have sworn I watched our family fracture in real time, the crushing realization that we had begun to care more about our pride than the warmth of our shared history drowning the last shreds of joy in the room. My niece started crying, and suddenly the world blurred around me. It felt like I was in a nightmare where nothing could be salvaged. I don't know how long I sat quietly afterwards as their voices echoed, part of me desperately wanting to bolt from that house, and yet another part wished to mend the fraying bonds of my family. I took a breath, willing to attempt a peace offering, only to have my sister shout that it wasn't about me, it was about the costs, almost as if she were trying to erase my existence from that evening. I watched as one sibling left in anger, the door slamming shut behind them, a hollow thud that lingered in the air and resonated deep within me. I can't recall how we finally settled down to the meal after that storm. Tension had wrapped itself around the uneaten turkey, the sides untouched, and we grappled through half-hearted cheers, the festive spirit sucked dry. After a painful pause, I left to the bathroom, desperately trying to breathe, and when I looked in the mirror, all I saw were the guilt-laden eyes of the niece I had disappointed, an image that would haunt me long past that evening. I stepped back into the dining room, shifting on my feet, feeling like I had stumbled into a family gathering less than ideal, a space that felt less like home than an echo of what we used to be. The atmosphere stank of resentment. As I murmured a quiet goodbye later, guilt churned, reminding me of people I loved, staring at their half-eaten plates riddled with an anguish that would linger, ready to haunt me as the holidays loom closer. My expectations, rather than bringing me into the fold, had created a rift that would deepen and darken into every Thanksgiving to follow. All that remained was the question, AITA for expecting not to have to pay for Thanksgiving groceries. And in the end, the answer was unfathomably clear: it cost more than money to keep a family together. When my grandmother passed away, she left us with a trove of jewelry, each piece laden with memories and whispers of family history woven into their ornate designs, and it was decided at her funeral that her prized possessions would go to her favorite, my cousin Sarah, who had always been vocal about her longing for them. I was more of a quiet observer in our family dynamics, something of an underdog constantly overlooked, so when the time came to talk about the inheritance, I stood back, allowing the others to discuss Sarah's claims, her tears, as they painted a picture of the deserving child, the granddaughter her heart favored. But not long after, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister lurking beneath the surface, a gnawing sensation that my grandmother would not have wanted to make that decision so neatly or so soon without considering the rest of us. I started looking at the jewelry the night after the funeral, each one glimmering under the soft light of the lamp, but it wasn't the sparkle that drew me in, it was the way they seemed to pulse with a life of their own, almost as if revealing stories only I could hear. The emerald pendant, my grandmother always said, held the spirit of protection, the silver bracelet twinkled with memories of laughter and mourning, and the pearl earrings, her most cherished, echoed the vows she took, binding family together. As the days passed, I sneaked out with the jewelry one evening to my grandmother's house, the winds howling against the glass like voices pleading, wearing a heavy weight of unease as I unlocked the door to her empty living room, the barren space feeling far too strange without her tender presence. I laid the items out on the table, compelled to remember each story, but as I did, the air turned thick, heavy with an electrifying tension that set my skin prickling. I whispered my grandmother's name, a desperate plea for wisdom, and suddenly I felt it, an icy breath against my neck, a presence so real that I spun around expecting to find someone, but there was only the whisper of moths tapping ineffectively against the windows. That night, sleep evaded me as I wrestled with visions of Sarah, her face twisted with disappointment should I fail to return the jewelry, yet my heart shuddered with the instinct that something wasn't right. Then came the nightmares. In them, my grandmother appeared, her ethereal face hovering above me, her lips chanted a warning I couldn't decipher, yet the urgency behind her eyes pierced through the fog of sleep. Each night, those dreams grew darker. I saw Sarah in the attic, rifling through boxes, her hands clawing at the memories I wanted to preserve. I felt a rush of anger, a need to step in, despite everyone else dismissing me as jealous or bitter, yet I was only following my grandmother's wishes. Days melted into each other, and I found myself ensnared in the tension of relatives crowded in my small living room, each eager to claim their share, everyone casting furtive glances in my direction, waiting for me to hand over what my grandmother had apparently promised to Sarah. I held my ground, aware that Sarah's eyes glinted in the reminder of friendship, tangled with loss, hers for my grandmother, and mine for the identities we were expected to wield as family members. As the pressure mounted, so too did the whispers. Rumors spread through the family like wildfire, accusations of greed unfurling over dinner tables, bitterness painting a rift between us. I considered surrendering the jewelry just to appease the storm of hurt feelings, yet around the same time, the jewelry began haunting me in ways I could not explain, strange occurrences swirling within the confines of the house, the lights flickering, objects rearranging themselves in the darkness, and echoes of laughter that seemed to originate from the pieces themselves. I couldn't help but wonder, did my grandmother bestow her earthly treasures with the intention of continuing a cycle, or did she craft them with the precision to repel tormentors like Sarah? Then came the revelation one stormy night when I sat in silence, the rain beating against the windows like a relentless drum. That was when I discovered the hidden compartment in the emerald pendant, the chill of the metal pricking at my fingertips as I worked to open it, revealing an old photograph of my grandmother in a flowing dress and a note, its edges frayed, penned with her delicate script, warning to keep the jewelry close, the ones who covet them may have intentions that corrupt. The moment I clutched that slip of paper, a warmth flooded through me, threads of connection stretching back through generations. The intent warned me away from surrendering the legacy she left behind. The next day, I finally approached Sarah, the sunlight splintering through dark clouds, making the moment feel almost surreal. I placed my hands on the table, grounding myself as I looked into my cousin's eyes, shimmering with tears and expectancy, and I told her how our grandmother would never have wanted this kind of animosity and entitlement stemming from love. Those gems were mine, bound through blood and shared history. The room fell silent, the tension sharper than any blade. I could see the reflection of other relatives in Sarah's pupils flip-flopping between support and a need for dissension, but something snapped inside me, and a fierce voice broke through, claiming our shared bond that had long been overshadowed by greed. Time froze momentarily, and to my shock, Sarah's expression shifted. Betrayal twisted her features, but then I noticed the shadows behind her, creeping along the edges of the room, a darkness that felt familiar and foreboding. It dawned upon me that I was not the only one who had heard my grandmother's pleas. The air thickened with disquiet as it dawned on me. I wasn't just defending some jewels, I was shielding our bloodline. Clutching the pendant close to my heart, I vowed to keep the jewelry not as a mere possession but as a guardian of stories that could not be tainted by envy or desire. I realized now that sometimes protecting a legacy meant making hard choices, forcing your hand against those you love, becoming the villain in their eyes to uphold the dignity of those departed. As the shadows receded slowly, I felt it, a quiet resolve wrapping an iron grip around my heart, knowing I was not wrong for resisting Sarah's claim but rather, I was right to protect what was more sacred than envy, our family. In that moment, the chains of our ancestral stories tightened like a noose, both a blessing and a curse, binding me to a fate I would uphold, in memory of her, against all odds, even if it meant sealing the very fate of our family. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation that blurred the lines between right and wrong, but as I stood outside the theater, the vibrant energy of the evening dulled by a series of increasingly impatient glances, I wondered if I had crossed an invisible boundary. I was there to see Wicked, a show I'd been looking forward to for months, and as the line wrapped around the building under the bright streetlights, anticipation thickened in the air. My phone buzzed incessantly with eager messages from friends eager to meet after the show, but I was determined to shut it out and soak up the excitement. That's when I saw her, a woman, mid-30s, vibrant red hair cascading over her shoulders, standing right in front of me, engrossed in an animated phone conversation that seemed all too important to her. I tried to ignore the growing annoyance in my chest and drowned out her loud laughter, but every witty retort and self-indulgent chuckle felt like a dagger driving deeper into the heart of my evening. I mean, come on. Some of us were here to enjoy an extraordinary performance, not to witness private conversations at full volume. As the minutes ticked down to the start time, my irritation boiled over. Excuse me. I mustered the courage to call out, the sound of my voice slicing through the buzz of excited chatter. She turned, her surprised eyes locking onto mine with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Can you please be a little quieter? Some of us actually want to enjoy the pre-show. The words rushed out like bile. A ripple of silence fell over the line, all eyes now glued to us. I could feel the weight of judgment in the air. What was supposed to be a brief moment of assertive clarity had turned into a live performance for the waiting crowd. Instead of shrinking back like I expected, she exploded. Aren't you just the biggest little snob? Her voice heightened, dripping with sarcasm. She held the phone in one hand, brandishing it like a sword, and her laughter abruptly transformed into a high-pitched giggle as if she were mocking me. Maybe if some of us weren't so uptight, we'd get to enjoy the show a bit more. Ever think of that? Each word hit hard, like stones thrown in anger, igniting a ripple of laughter behind her as her friends rallied around the charge. My fists clenched at my sides, the blood pounding in my ears so loudly I could barely hear my thoughts. I could see other theatergoers carving out their opinion in the way they looked at me, a mix of sympathy and disapproval. It was then that a realization struck, a crack in my composure. Maybe I was being unreasonable, but that didn't stop my temper from flaring, and before I knew it, I yelled back, maybe you don't need to share every detail of your miserable life with the world. Ever think some of us are here to escape it? The gasp from the crowd was palpable, like a sudden intake of breath before an intense scene. The woman's face twisted in disbelief, her laughter abruptly cut off, leaving a painful silence hanging in the chilly night air. An angry flush crept up my neck, and just when I thought the moment might pass, she stepped closer, her eyes narrowed and her voice dropping to a whisper, bitter and low. "You think this is a show for you to escape to? You've only scratched the surface of what life can throw at you, and let me tell you, and I know you won't believe me, this is nothing compared to real pain." I felt something twist in my gut at the challenge in her gaze, a feeling that there was more at play than just a rude theatergoer. Each heartbeat echoed with my growing unease, and the crowd around us felt like they were holding their breath, waiting for a resolution to this absurdity that had taken on a life of its own. She was right, in a way. How could I know what monsters lurked in her reality? But as the theater doors swung open, spilling warm light and murmurs of music out into the cool night air, I realized I didn't care. I was tired, too tired, of dealing with selfish people in a world that oftentimes felt far too chaotic. Without thinking, I waved her off dismissively, my voice laced with frustration. "Whatever. Enjoy your unnecessary phone call." That must have struck a nerve, because she glanced back at me for a split second before rejoining her group of friends, and just as quickly as the confrontation had begun, it fizzled. I was left there, feeling the weight of my anger linger, tangled with something more profound, an unsettling sense of dread. The show started, and I tried to immerse myself in the enchantment of emerald green costumes and soaring melodies, but her laughter still rang in my ears, creating a friction in my mind I couldn't shake. What if she's right? My own thoughts haunted me like phantoms as I watched the story unfold on stage, the vibrant colors slipping by but never fully capturing my attention. Images of her piercing green eyes, that moment of shared rage, replayed in my mind. Who was I to judge anyone's choices, especially when my own life felt tangled and unpredictable? Then something shifted. I noticed she was sitting 2 rows down from me as the act wore on, and to my dismay, they were still laughing, still talking, this time at a whisper, but clearly still engaged with their phones, still distracting in ways that made me grit my teeth. The frustration boiled over again until I could stand it no longer. I stood up, heart pounding, and hissed, "Can you please just put your phones away and watch the show?" The words felt like fire leaping from my throat, but all they earned me was a triumphant glance from the woman. It was as if she was waiting for this, even expecting me to lash out again, and that was when I knew it was no longer about her phone call. It was an insidious dance of power and pride, and I was entrapped. She casually leaned back, smirk lacing her features. "You really think making this a bigger spectacle makes you some kind of hero?" She shot back, laughter bubbling from her lips, buoyed by the cheers of her friends. My blood turned to ice, and it dawned on me, I was being played. Her deliberate entrapment had turned the heat of my anger into a fiery embarrassment. Just as I recoiled, I felt a deep pull of anxiety fill the recesses of my mind, like an extreme panic gnawing at me, and I sank back into my seat, overwhelmed. I was now the unwitting star of a show I didn't intend to be in, and all I wanted was to disappear. After the final curtain call, I stumbled out onto the streets, a numbing shame seeping into my bones. I was both the villain and the fool, caught in a careless confrontation that had turned the joyous night sour. But as I walked away, I couldn't quite shake the sense that this experience had changed something within me. It was no longer just about her phone call, it was a mirror reflecting my own failings and a story that continued on without me, left to fester on the streets as I disappeared into the night. Was I the asshole for yelling? Maybe. But the truth stung brighter than any shame. Honesty splintered in a way I hadn't expected. My life was messy, and sometimes boundaries need to be drawn, even at the cost of losing sight of the enchantment a show could bring. So maybe, just maybe, the real question was, could I forgive myself for demanding silence in a world filled with chaos, or chalk it all up to an unhappy accident never to be resolved? I should probably start by mentioning that my mom had always been a force of nature, a woman whose opinions could make or break the day. I used to look up to her, wanting to wear the same stylish clothes and have the same kind of confidence she exuded, but that changed after last year's family gathering when she casually mentioned I had gained weight over the winter. It wasn't said in a cruel way, but rather in her blunt, unyielding tone that left me reeling. At first, I thought about shrugging it off. After all, taste buds can drive the unwary to indulgence, but as weeks passed, I found myself trapping echoes of her words in the corners of my mind. Fast forward a few months later, we were preparing for my sister's wedding, a grand event that would showcase every family member and friend dressed to the nines. When my mom and I went dress shopping, I could feel anticipation buzzing in my veins, but it was bittersweet. Each dress was lovely, but as the sunlight grazed the mirror, it caught the fickle shadows of self-doubt, and every tug of fabric was accompanied by her scrutinizing gaze. Then came the moment I feared. She picked a stunning red dress and held it out like a trophy, but when I emerged from the dressing room, her reaction was not what I hoped for. "You know, honey, I think something a bit looser would suit you better," she said casually, her thin smile carrying an insidious weight. The words hung over me like a cloud threatening rain, and suddenly, all the mannequins seemed to close in around me, like they were whispering to each other. I felt the heat of shame creep through my cheeks, but something snapped. The soft, timid girl she had raised faded into the background as indignation bloomed. I stood there, heart pounding, and said, "AITA for telling Mom I will buy my own dress after she called me fat?" She blinked as if I had just thrown a glass of cold water in her face, and a shaky silence enveloped us. I turned my back, slipping back into the dressing room, and suddenly the chaos outside felt muffled, almost unreal. I wanted to scream, to cry, but instead, I felt a wave of empowerment wash over me. Why did I care what she thought? I rifled through the cheap dresses on the rack. The gaudy sequins and tearing seams felt welcoming in their imperfection. I tried on a simple emerald green gown that fit me like it was tailored just for me, and when I stepped back into the light, something shifted. The vision of the woman I used to be began to morph into something brand new, something brimming with defiance. I slid into the floor-length skirt, the color wrapping around me like a promise. When I looked in the mirror, the reflection staring back wasn't just a girl burdened by her mother's words, it was a woman ready to make a statement, pursuing her independence, daring to redefine beauty on her own terms, and for the first time in a long while, I gasped with joy. I finally came to realize my worth was not tethered to the fabric my mother handed me, and as I walked back, the emerald dress swaying with each step, I could see the shift in her expression. Her eyes widened, a hint of surprise dancing in the corner of her mouth. "That actually looks lovely," she stammered, and something dark twisted in my gut, mingling anger and reluctant acceptance, as I remembered how her voice pierced through my happiness weeks ago. I shook my head, still feeling the rush of courage from leaving her disapproval behind as I answered, "Thanks, but I've decided I'll get my own dress for the wedding." The silence, thick and uncomfortable, tangled in the air between us as I could feel the tension coil tighter, her eyes flaring momentarily with disbelief before rolling into disappointment. She sighed heavily, as if the weight of disappointment in me bore down, and while I once sought her approval, this rejection tasted different. It felt like freedom. I floated to the store entrance, my heart racing but my mind clearer than it had been in weeks, and when I bought the dress on my own terms, I felt like I was taking a bold step into the future instead of shying away from past shadows. Yet in the days leading up to the wedding, I could feel her gaze lingering, a cold prickling on my back as if she were waiting for the right moment to unleash her disappointment, and I braced myself as those wedding bells chimed. When the day finally came, I felt invincible as I pulled that emerald dress over my body, my reflection glowing with defiance. I triumphed through the crowd, my dad beaming with pride, yet behind me, I could sense my mom's silence. That characteristic sharpness in her smirk was nowhere to be found. As the vows exchanged resonated before us, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere deep down, spite lingered in that corner of her heart. Maybe she thought I'd regret standing up for myself, but as I took in the twinkling lights and the wild laughter around me, I knew I wouldn't take that confidence back for anything. The reception was euphoric until, just before it crescendoed, I caught my mother's eyes across the room. She approached, and the air thickened as tension crackled between us. "You really should have let me help you pick something more flattering," she murmured, a thin smile resting on her face but a storm brewing in her expression. My heart raced, and for a moment, I felt the girl I used to be creeping back, whispering to shrink under her disdain, but I wasn't having it. Channeling everything I felt the moment I decided to reclaim my story, I stated firmly, "No, Mom. This is who I am, and if you can't support me, then maybe I was right to buy my own dress after all." She hesitated, an army of emotions flashing through her eyes, and in that moment, I saw both loss and fear mingling with something close to admiration. As the music filled the room and laughter broke around us, I felt the sharp edges of my insecurities dulling, transforming into an armor I never knew I needed. We could stand in the tension of our differences, or I could embrace the freedom that came with walking away from the need for her approval. I walked away from her then, joining my friends who were twirling joyfully under the fairy lights, a smile bursting anew as I danced beneath the stars, and while I could still feel her distant gaze, it didn't pierce through my newfound strength. It simply faded into the background, a reminder that sometimes, to find yourself, you must sever the chains holding you to hurtful expectations, and in that moment, I wasn't just wearing an emerald dress, I was wearing the knowledge that I was enough, just as I am. I'm not sure how to start this without sounding melodramatic, but I need to share this before it eats me alive. My friend Danny, who, like me, is 23 years old, had been pestering me to set him up with my best friend, Laura, for months. She's beautiful, smart, and genuinely one of the best people I know. We had been friends since childhood, and after a slew of terrible dates, I thought, why not? On paper, they seemed like a match made in heaven, both love horror movies, the same music, and they both had quirky senses of humor. But every time I tried to broker this budding romance, something fell through. He would flirt with her one moment and then completely ghost her the next, and I could see how it hurt Laura when he'd vanish as if she were nothing. Finally, I confronted Danny about it. What's your deal? If you want to date her, then do it. Don't just toy with her feelings, I told him one night as we shared drinks. He shrugged it off, saying he was just busy. I didn't buy it, but I let it go, until the day they finally met up, a Friday night that still haunts me. When I got the call from Laura the next morning, I could hardly believe what I was hearing. He stood me up, and he didn't even text me to say he wouldn't come, she choked out between sobs, and as she recounted her harrowing experience waiting in that stupid cafe with her heart in her throat, I felt rage boil within me. Danny had let her wait for 2 hours before sending a text that something came up, which is code for, I couldn't care less about you. I spent the rest of the weekend comforting Laura, who couldn't understand what had gone wrong. She deserved better, and all I could think of was Danny's selfishness. The following week, I told Danny I was done helping him. AITA for refusing to set up my friend anymore after he stood up my best friend? I asked him directly, hoping for some sign of remorse, but he shrugged it off as if it didn't matter. He laughed, a hollow sound that seemed to echo in the confines of my mind, and that's when I noticed it, the change in him, something darker lurking beneath the surface. I thought it was just disappointment at being denied a date, but then things started getting weird. A few days later, Laura and I found a note on her car windshield, scrawled in handwriting I didn't recognize, reading, "You should find someone who actually wants you," and it sent chills down my spine. I dismissed it as some random jerk, but then she began receiving messages on social media from a profile with no followers or posts. The person behind it clearly knew things about her that they shouldn't have, places she frequented and inside jokes we had shared. Each time I texted Danny, he ignored me or gave flippant responses that made my stomach twist. "My bad," he'd write back. "I've been busy." I had started keeping track of the odd notes and the increasingly menacing messages Laura was receiving. They grew more and more detailed, leaning closer toward stalking. I began to wonder if it was all a sick game played by Danny to get back at Laura for humiliating him by uncovering his true nature. But I didn't confront him again, fearing what might happen if I pushed. I was convinced he was somehow involved, they were intertwined in a twisted fate that I could no longer untangle. On a freezing December evening, Laura and I went out to grab some groceries, both feeling the weight of the ominous recent events. She pulled out her phone and went pale. There it was again, a message waiting for her, "You should really stay home tonight." The lights flickered above us as a sickening chill washed over me, and I could swear that a shadow crossed over the grocery store. Moments later, Laura and I split up to grab the last few items on our list, and when I turned down the cereal aisle, I noticed a figure at the far end. His back was turned to me, but his posture was all too familiar. Panic surged through me. Danny had been sneaking around while I wasn't paying attention. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough for me to glimpse his face, and I felt my heart drop. It wasn't Danny at all, but someone who looked alarmingly similar, a glint of madness in his eyes. I froze, the grocery list slipping from my hands. Before I could move, he took a single step toward me, and in that moment, the lights went out. All I could hear was the sound of frantic breathing and an overwhelming sense of dread. I bolted, screaming for Laura as I raced through the store, grabbing at the edges of my sanity. I found her in the aisle, her face ghostly pale, and she was gripping her phone tightly, shaking. "Did you see him?" she whispered, and I nodded, still reeling from the terror of being so close to something I couldn't explain. In the following days, I made the hard choice to go to the police, warily explaining the situation. They brushed it off, saying it could be a prank, but something in my gut told me otherwise. Then, without warning, Laura disappeared. 1 minute she was there, and then she was gone, spilling laughter and warmth into the world, and the next, it was like she had never existed. My heart ached, frantically searching for signs of her in her usual hangouts, social media, anything, and every night I returned to my darkened apartment, guilt gnawing at my mind like the predator it had become. I finally reached out to Danny one last time, hoping against hope that he would tell me where she was, but all I got was a deadpan "you should have stayed out of it." It was a message so straightforward it cut through me, and desperation consumed me as I tried tracing back everything that had happened. It finally hit me, every dark turn we took led back to him. I couldn't let it go, and so, the next Thursday, I found myself standing outside his apartment, too many unanswered questions pulling me toward confrontation. I knocked on the door. I didn't care if I appeared insane. The door creaked open, revealing him, a sly grin stretching across his face. "Thought you might come," he said, stepping aside to let me in, as if he planned this all along. When I stepped inside, the stench hit me like a freight train. "What's wrong with you?" I managed, feeling sick. There were notes scattered everywhere, torn photographs plastered on walls, the evidence of his obsession. I saw Laura's face among them, eyes wide in terror, and it felt like my entire world collapsed. He turned to me, eyes gleaming. "She made me do this. If you had just let me have her, none of this would have happened." I staggered backward in horror as he reached for something behind him. Was it a knife? But I dipped sideways, ducking and sprinting for the door. I burst outside, adrenaline propelling me forward, and just as I neared the stairs, I heard him call after me, a low chuckle echoing through the hallway. "See you soon." I never found Laura. The police still refused to believe me. Danny is still out there, lurking, with secrets that threaten to break through the cracks of reality. As for me, I live in fear every day that he'll find me, too, because I know what he did, and he's not done yet. So, AITA for refusing to set my friend up ever again? I guess I'll never know, as I am too afraid of what darkness lies within the heart of those you think you know. The truth is, I simply can't afford to find out. I never thought a simple issue like punctuality could unravel my life in such a terrifying way, but here I am, staring blankly at my phone, the glint of the screen reflecting my dread as I anticipate their all-too-familiar late arrival. My in-laws, the Johnsons, have turned tardiness into an art form. You see, it's not just the usual 15 minutes late, but often an hour, 2 hours, or sometimes not at all. Yes, they've pulled that stunt too, leaving me waiting in the restaurant, awkwardly pretending to enjoy a glass of wine while I wonder if they've been kidnapped by aliens or simply decided they'd rather binge-watch Friends than honor my dinner invitation. It's been years of this, and I've reached my breaking point. After yet another instance of me pacing the restaurant like a caged animal, I snapped and texted them a harsh message before this latest dinner with my wife's family: "If you can't make it on time, don't come at all." When they finally arrived, nearly an hour late, my father-in-law's face twisted in confusion, while my mother-in-law tutted softly, like a schoolteacher reprimanding a particularly dull student. But I didn't back down when they stormed out, leaving the restaurant empty and echoing our abandoned table. The rest of the evening was a tense silence at home, the air thick with my wife's disappointment, which turned to anger after she received a text from her mother, suggesting her husband was a monster who couldn't handle a few minor inconveniences. That night, I lay in bed listening to the muffled sounds of my wife on her phone, her whispered arguments and the occasional near sob causing shadows to loom taller in our bedroom, until, at last, she turned toward me and refused to speak, her back a cold wall of resentment. Days went by after this explosive dinner, leaving me isolated and uncertain, with strings of tension that felt heavier than the very air I breathed, filling our home with an oppressive silence that buzzed around me. I started noticing things. Maybe my nerves were getting to me, but every time I walked past my in-laws' house, the curtains would twitch just a little too much, and I could swear I saw shadows that felt out of place, as if someone was always watching, waiting for a moment to pounce. My phone lit up late one night, a photo from my mother-in-law. The image showed my unseen daughter, barely 3 years old, standing at the window with that innocent, quizzical gaze, while the backyard glowed with an unsettling, almost unnatural light. I felt my insides twist when I noticed the reflection in the window behind her. It was my mother-in-law, but there was something wrong in her eyes, something wild, a glint that sent ice running through my veins, though I brushed it off as paranoia, convinced I was simply spiraling due to the stress of family tensions. But things only escalated. I began finding notes on my car, slipped under the windshield wipers that only read, "Time is slipping away," with no signature. just a trembling anxiety creeping further into my soul. I told my wife about it, although I regretted the moment I saw the doubt construct a fortress around her disbelief, and she suggested I was overstressed, living in a fog of paranoia, but I knew better. Something was horribly wrong, and it seemed to mirror the late arrivals of my in-laws. One rainy evening as I returned from work, I noticed them standing in their driveway, drenched, appearing almost ghostly in the dim light, and when they finally approached, they had that same eerie look. They claimed to have just arrived back from a trip, yet this wasn't a regular visit. My skin prickled with dread as I processed that the clothes they wore didn't match weather conditions, nor did they carry any luggage. They insisted on spending time with my daughter, and despite my instincts screaming at me to protect her, my wife played along, and I could only hang back, unease coiling like a serpent in my gut as they led her into the dark house, a cavernous maw waiting to swallow innocent laughter. Things went completely dark when my daughter didn't return for hours, and I rushed around, pacing, calling her name before I banged down my in-laws' door, only to find them sitting there, hazy, eyes shimmering as they told me they were just having fun. Yet my little girl's absence felt like an eternity, and each second stretched into endless possibilities, a knot twisted unyieldingly at my core. Panic welled inside me, erupting into visceral desperation as I tore through their house, the fading scent of something metallic pulling me further into the nightmare unfolding within each stagnant room as I began seeing bizarre photographs plastered on the walls, pictures of children playing but with disturbing overtones of something nefarious, like their laughter was forcibly infused into each snapshot, faces twisted into grotesque smiles that made my skin crawl. I finally found my daughter, sitting eerily still in a dim-lit kitchen, her eyes glazed over, staring blankly into space, as if something had siphoned the brightness from her soul. When I reached for her, a voice, low and viscous, crawled through the air, laced with ethereal confidence that suggested they had been waiting for me all along. "You have to let her stay, she's ours now." With a primal scream, I ripped my daughter from the table, sprinting out of the house while a collective whisper cascaded behind me, sharpness in the air, promising I had only buried the truth of their generational curse deeper beneath a facade of civility. I bolted down the street, holding my child tightly as the relentless echoes of their laughter melded into a cacophony of threat behind me. Now, every time I hear the doorbell ring or see their silhouettes hovering in the corner of my eye, I am reminded that I can't escape the haunting truth. It's all interconnected, the waiting, the late arrivals, the suffocating silence betraying a sinister undercurrent that knows our fears and plays with them like a puppet master, realizing now that my choice to demand punctuality had awakened something within them that shouldn't have been stirred, and perhaps I sealed our fate when I thought I was just standing my ground. I never thought Thanksgiving would be the day everything would unravel, but here we are, just a few days away from the holiday when my brother decided to bring his new girlfriend into the family fold. Now, Logan had always been a bit impulsive, jumping from one relationship to another like a child on a trampoline, but this new girl, Tara, was something else. Our family is tight-knit, built on love and respect, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about her. It started a few weeks ago at a family barbecue. Tara showed up uninvited, slinking into our backyard in a low-cut dress and high heels, her laughter too loud and forced. I remember my wife, Sarah, greeting her with a warm smile, the kind that melts the heart, but Tara, with a dismissive wave, merely rolled her eyes, shooting back a caustic remark about how basic the whole event was. I felt the atmosphere freeze, Sarah's smile faltered, and the warmth of family quickly turned to awkwardness, the kind you feel in the pit of your stomach when someone's just been insulted in a room where everyone should feel safe. Despite the tension, I shrugged it off. Relationships take time, maybe she was just a little too much wine and not enough maturity. But then, the comments kept coming. It was like she had a vendetta against my wife, each word woven into a tapestry of disdain. At the next family gathering, she brought up how funny it was that I had the same job for 5 years, as if my dedication to our family's financial security was laughable, but, of course, Logan, ever the oblivious one, just laughed along. My heart raced as I watched Sarah's face contort with hurt. I approached Logan later and voiced my concerns, but he dismissed me, insisting I was being overprotective. It escalated from there, and I couldn't take it anymore. I made it clear, Tara wasn't welcome at our Thanksgiving dinner. This was a day for family, love, and gratitude, not taunts and jabs at the dinner table. When I broke the news to Logan, he went quiet, his face morphing into disbelief and anger, like I'd slapped him. "You can't just dictate who I can date," he exploded, red-faced and incensed. I stood my ground. "I'm not dictating anything, I'm protecting my family." Our conversation devolved into a fight, complete with accusations of me being controlling and unfair. It spiraled until we were both shouting, and I could see the hurt in his eyes, that I was pushing him away. But then he brought Sarah into it, saying that if she couldn't handle a little teasing, maybe I shouldn't have married her. That hit harder than any insult Tara had thrown, and I felt an icy rage boil inside me. Thanksgiving came, the air crisp and chilly, and I still buzzed with anger. Sarah was tentative around me, unsure of how to ease the tension brewing like a storm above our family eagle's nest, as she called it. I thought about all that Tara had put her through, how she had disrespected the very foundation of our lives together. The day of Thanksgiving dawned bright, but the shadow of the upcoming confrontation loomed large. I spent the day cooking, the scents of turkey and stuffing filling our home, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Logan, wondering if he'd take the high road or wash his hands of our family tradition. Then, the doorbell rang, and I knew who it was before I even looked through the peephole. There he stood, all confident bravado, with Tara clinging to his arm like a leech. I opened the door, plastering on a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Hey, Logan. Happy Thanksgiving," I said, already regretting every bit of small talk that was about to ensue. "Thanks, man, good to see you," he replied, his voice leeching with tension as he glanced at my face for any sign of approval. Tara, however, was a different story. Rather than grace myself with a simple hello, she leaned in close to me and whispered, "You're really upset I'm here, aren't you, sweetie?" In a tone so saccharine it made my teeth ache. I could taste the bile rising in my throat as the words hung thick in the air. I forced a laugh, but inside, I was battling the monster of rage swarming my insides. I ushered them inside and busied myself with the preparations, Sarah already setting the table with an uncharacteristically somber expression. Tara breezed around the house, commenting on the decorations, how they looked cheap, as if she had any room to talk, and I was ready to snap. Dinner came, and we all settled down, tension thick enough to slice with a knife. Small talk morphed into a battlefield, and as Tara consumed her plate, every word dripped with thinly veiled mockery directed at my wife until Sarah excused herself and left the table. I caught a glimpse of her eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, and something inside me snapped. I stood up so hard my chair toppled over. "Tara, if you can't show my wife respect in her own home, you don't deserve to be here and neither does Logan," I spat, all of my pent-up frustration exploding in a mixture of protective love and seething anger. The table fell silent, forks frozen in midair, as Logan shot out of his chair, flaring with indignation. "You're being unreasonable. She's my girlfriend," he screamed, the table shaking under the weight of his fury. But it was Tara that caught me off guard when she leaned back and said, "Honestly, your life sounds pathetic. I feel sorry for your wife." My heart dropped like lead, the air became thick with something heavy. Was it hatred or contempt? I took a breath, steadying myself. "You're right, Tara, I do feel sorry for you. You've managed to entangle yourself with a man who clearly doesn't see the damage you're doing." Logan looked stricken, staring between us, torn. That was when I reached my breaking point, turning to him and saying, "You deserve better than this and so does she. I'm not the bad guy here, you are. I'll choose family over a petty squabble with a woman who can't respect my wife." I suddenly felt hollow and exposed, a dark mantle of anger and shame wrapping around me. Logan shook his head in fury, and I saw a ripple of realization cross his face, the anger twisting into a profound confusion. Tara stood there, smugly, as if to say she had just won a twisted game of chess where she expected to claim the crown. That's when I kicked them out, a moment that felt both immensely satisfying and eviscerating at the same time. I slammed the door behind them, breathing heavily, my heart racing faster than it had in years as I faced the fallout. I turned to find Sarah framed in the kitchen doorway, her face a landscape of conflicting emotions, pride, sadness, and relief, all tangled into a sorrowful smile. The room felt different, lighter somehow, as we held each other's gaze, and in that moment, I knew we could withstand anything, while all I could think about was whether I had chosen rightly for my family. Maybe I wasn't in the wrong after all. The evening faded into laughter, warmth, and heads bowed in thanks, filled with new traditions where respect governed the values we all held dear. A thin veil hung over the doorway where resentment no longer dared cross. I'm not one to air my dirty laundry in public, but this has started to feel like a living nightmare, and I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. It began a few months ago when my husband, Greg, started bringing home a collection of vintage radios he found at estate sales. I thought it was a quirky yet harmless hobby, but soon his obsession took a twisted turn. He'd spend hours tinkering away in our dimly lit basement, meticulously restoring each radio, which at first felt endearing, but later it morphed into something more sinister. It was the way he talked to them, like they were old friends or confidants. He'd sit cross-legged on the floor, fiddling with the dials, murmuring, "It's all right, buddy, we'll get you fixed up soon," and I couldn't shake off the chill running down my spine each time I heard him. It drove me mad with worry, yet I brushed it off as one of those midlife crises that men seem to have. Then one night, after another exhausting day at work, I just snapped. I stood at the foot of the basement stairs, shivering as I listened to another muffled, almost pleading voice emanating from the radios, distorted but strangely urgent. Suddenly, a cacophony of static interrupted the night, and the voice seemed to weave through the cracks, promising unseen things like events to come or secrets better left unearthed. My heart raced, and I screamed down the stairs, "Shut up, Greg." It echoed in the walls, reaching an unnatural pitch as an unsettling silence fell over the room. I just wanted it to end, his nights of obsessive tinkering that pulled him deeper into madness while I stood helpless, watching him slip away, one radio at a time. He appeared moments later, confusion painted on his face, and I saw the way he almost flinched at my outburst. I panicked, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. "It's not me," he insisted, his voice trembled, emotion heavy in the silence. But it couldn't have been anything else. I noticed a new radio near the stairs, an old RCA model with the eeriest of designs, weathered and tarnished, as if it had been pulled from a grave. "You have to stop this," I begged, my voice cracking, tears blurring my sight as shadows flickered in the corner of my vision. He turned away, mumbling something I couldn't decipher, racing back into the basement as the static returned, washing over me like a haunting wave. Almost nightly, Greg would descend into that basement filled with technological nightmares, each repair entrenching him deeper in a cycle, while I lay awake, haunted by the murmurings of voices that twisted through the floors like an underground river of secrets. The static grew louder, more persistent, rising in unison with my anxiety until insomnia claimed its throne. My husband, so consumed by whatever he was chasing, became a ghost in our home. I missed the small gestures, his laughter, and the warmth we'd once shared. "You'll regret it," a voice floated from the radio one evening, its tone chilling, as if it were mocking my desperate pleas to save my husband and reclaim the life we once had. I decided I couldn't let it spiral any further. I rummaged through the basement one evening, ready to confront whatever was festering in the dark when I felt the radios watching me. More than just machines, they were menacing, malevolent eyes that drew me into their magnetic hold. That night, I pulled one from its place beneath Greg's clutter and brought it back upstairs, flinging it onto the kitchen table. "You want to talk?" I shouted, edging closer as I flipped the switch on. A jarring screech filled the air, and I immediately regretted the choice. I could have sworn I felt a chill grip my heart as I crouched near it. Rather than finding the static, I heard a voice clearer than before, yet it was Greg's, wrapped in layers of regret and something darker. "I told you not to listen." My stomach sank, pulling me deeper into a black pit of fear as I realized this was not just a radio, it was a vessel, a conduit for something that had crept into our lives, turning my husband into a hollow shell consumed by static and whispers of things I couldn't understand. "Make it stop," I pleaded, desperation clawing at my throat as the voice twisted my thoughts around like vines choking the life from a tree. The radio crackled. "You should have listened." I dropped it, my heart pounding like a war drum, the echoes haunting my mind, and in that instant, Greg stood behind me, his eyes wild, unfocused as if he were looking through me rather than at me. I took a step back, fear radiating from my every sense, and mumbled an apology, but all he did was shake his head slowly, a sorrowful expression creeping across his features. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice breaking as he reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed against the vintage radio, almost as if trying to beg it for forgiveness. "It won't end until I'm finished." Something in me snapped anew as I knew I had to take a stand. So much of him was trapped down there, I could feel it like a frayed string of yarn unraveling into madness, and before he could fully comprehend, I grabbed the radio, my heart racing, smashing it against the floor with a sickening crack, the voice wailing as pieces exploded. In an instant, his expression morphed into a sharp, raging understanding, like a fuse had been lit. "What have you done?" Silence fell like a heavy blanket as I held my breath, terrified I'd unleashed some unknown horror. When he lunged at me, it surprised even myself. I flung myself backward, landing against the countertop, my heart racing like a runaway train. "You're not yourself," I shouted back at him, my own panic-laden voice filled with the raw edge of fear. And suddenly, it became apparent, this wasn't just a hobby gone awry, it was something greater, clawing into every crevice of our lives, testing our trust, our love, and I realized that letting it consume us would mean losing everything I held dear. The basement rattled, a deep rumble emanating from below, as if the radios were screaming all at once, unseen cries of the damned that echoed through our home. I felt fragile from the weight it threatened to crush me with, and as I faced my husband, seeing the shadows of the old radio flickering behind him, despair washed over me. But it wasn't just despair, it was a promise, a whisper caressing my ear, warning me of the dark abyss waiting to swallow us whole if I didn't fight with everything I had left. "We can fix this," I shouted, emotions surging like tidal waves, "but you need to see the truth." His expression shifted, and for a moment, the shadows behind him seemed to relent, flickering like fading embers, as if my words echoed just enough to ignite a flicker of clarity deep within him. With each heartbeat, I felt the bond trying to mend, the air charged with the remnants of names unspoken and hopes tethered to unseen forces. "Please." I barely managed to breathe, tears flooding my vision. "I don't want to lose you." And just like that, something sparked in those hollow eyes. For a split second, I saw my husband emerge from the depths of shadows, an insistent flicker of warmth breaking through the cold facade. But then the shadows behind Greg twisted malevolently, deep laughter, sly and insistent, trickled out, reminding me of how close he had come to losing himself entirely. The moment shattered as I felt chilling breaths emanating from the ruins of the shattered radio, its remnants still alive with echoes of things unnamed. I stormed out, but as I reached the front door, turning back nervously, my heart sank. His silhouette was gone, and in its place was an impenetrable dark, with static rising hauntingly in the air. "Shut up!" I screamed into the void, a raw shout of defiance against the encroaching darkness. In the eerie stillness that followed, I genuinely wondered if I would ever get my husband back, or if he was now nothing more than a note in a forgotten song, static lost to the frequencies of madness. And now, as I type this, I keep glancing at that basement door, terrified that one day I might hear his voice calling, urging me to join him in the void, asking if I would finally understand what it meant to listen. Or if in that moment, I'd finally lose my last chance to save him from the creeping horrors that whispered in the night. I've always loved Thanksgiving, the extended family gatherings, the laughter, the food, and even the familiar bickering. This year, though, was different. My cousin Eric's girlfriend, Amanda, was 3 months pregnant and had decided to join us, which everyone was excited about, except for me. For some reason, Amanda had that air of drama swirling around her, a sort of chaotic energy that made me uneasy. The moment she stepped into my house, I felt a chill skitter down my spine. I didn't know if it was the winter wind or something about her gaze that seemed to promise trouble. Everyone else cooed over her, patted her belly, shared stories of their own parenting experiences, but I kept my distance. That night, as we all settled in for the Thanksgiving feast, my mom revealed there weren't enough beds in the house, so Amanda would have to sleep on the couch. This sparked an argument. Eric went all protective mode, insisting she could take his room, but my parents put their foot down, explaining that the couch was more than enough for one night. I felt a strange satisfaction wash over me as I watched Amanda's cheeks flush with anger, though I would later wish I'd kept that emotion locked away. After dinner, while everyone was engrossed in swapping family stories, I pulled Amanda aside, half expecting an apology, but instead, she confronted me with this glint in her eye that made me take a step back. "You think I'm here to ruin your perfect Thanksgiving? You don't know the half of it," she hissed. I wanted to laugh it off, but there was a flicker of something maniacal in her voice, something that said she wasn't just kidding. I shrugged it off, returning to the warmth of family, which suddenly felt a little too warm, suffocating under layers of heated conversations. Hours passed, and we finally retired for the night, but I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing faint whispers from the living room, the cadence of voices, but it wasn't just my family. It felt like there was something lurking outside the perimeter of our joy, creeping in with every soft chuckle and snicker. Around 2 a.m., I heard a loud thud, a sound that jolted me awake. I leapt from my bed and rushed into the living room, my heart pounding, ready to confront whatever had woken me. The couch was empty, Amanda was gone. Feeling a sense of dread stewing in my stomach, I called for her, and the sound echoed through the dark house, but there was no answering call. Panic set in as I sprinted to the front door. It was ajar, the cold night air swirling in threateningly, and I stepped outside, scanning the shadows, my breath coming in quick, icy puffs. That's when I spotted her, huddled against the porch railing, whispering frantically into her phone. As I got closer, I could hear the sharpness in her voice, the words turning into erratic sentences. No, it's a mistake. They don't know yet, just keep it hidden. I'll figure it out. Just give me more time. My skin prickled, a chill gripped me as dread wrapped tightly around my throat. Before I could speak, she turned, and the look in her eyes, one of sheer panic, became engraved in my mind. You shouldn't be out here, she said sharply, her demeanor shifting, an unsettling mask slipping into place. I stepped back, feeling quite small, while her expression turned to something darker. As I tried to recover the right words, there was a sudden rustle from behind me. I whipped around to see a figure emerge from the shadows, silhouette lurking just beyond the porch light. It looked like a man, tall and cloaked in darkness, but I couldn't make out his features. Amanda froze, then dropped her phone, eyes wide, and in that instant, I knew there was something utterly wrong. The man advanced toward us, a slow, predatory movement, and my instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. Horror rendered me immobile. You should have listened, the man growled, and with that, Amanda turned and bolted, the sound of her footsteps like thunder across the wooden porch. The man followed, and I finally snapped out of my stupor, rushing back inside and locking the door behind me, my breath ragged as I tried to gather my thoughts. I could hear Eric shouting her name from the other room, frantic and terrified as we all scrambled into the dark, hushed living room, the turkey and stuffing forgotten. We fanned out, searching for her, but it felt like an eternity until I spotted her through the frosted window, the shape of her bracing against the cold while Eric bellowed out pleas for her to come back. The man was gone, vanished into the ether like a specter of our worst fears. It was then I noticed the small puddle at my feet. I crouched down, the blood rushing to my ears, and I felt something cold grip my heart when I realized it was Amanda's phone, cracked and broken, the screen still lit. I picked it up and saw the last message on the screen: everything is in place. Just make it through the night. My blood ran cold as I looked at Eric, his face pale, worry-etching lines in his forehead, all of us frozen at that moment, tethered to a mystery that suddenly felt too close to home. Thanksgiving stretched into a nightmarish spiral of frantic calls and desperate searching, turning from family connections to sheer terror as Eric's pleas devolved into frenzied screaming the moment he learned Amanda was gone. We all felt it, a stranglehold of unease cloaked around our hearts. The police arrived, and everything blurred into chaos. They asked questions, but the answers were lost in disbelief, and in the flurry of sirens and blue lights, I felt a growing chasm of guilt filling my chest. It was my insistence on making Amanda sleep on the couch that had set this night into motion. Eric clung to the slice of hope that turned into despair as the hours crept on, tainted by the realization that we were merely pieces on a board of a game we never signed up for. In the end, they labeled it an abduction, a cold case that wouldn't let rest. That Thanksgiving, once filled with so much joy, morphed into a haunting echo in my mind, a chilling reminder that sometimes, the shadows of our decisions extend far beyond the light we perceive. I haven't been able to shake off the guilt, especially since the day Amanda disappeared was the day that I realized my family would never be the same. Now, every Thanksgiving brings back that crushing reality, a stain on our memories, and I can't help but wonder if she's still out there somewhere waiting, or if she's merely a ghost in the hollow echoes of family gatherings, sleeping on a couch that will forever remain vacant, a haunting reminder that some choices lead us to darkness, where the light can no longer reach. I wasn't the kind of guy who went around crushing the dreams of 7-year-olds, but something about my girlfriend's brother, Timmy, always rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he puffed out his chest as if he were a king while wearing his oversized superhero pajamas, or the fact that he made me play against him in video games every single time I came over because he was convinced he could beat me if I just dared to try. I used to let him win. Sure, I'd play a little harder than normal, but I figured it built his confidence. Timmy was a sweet kid otherwise, always the first to offer me a cookie from his stash or show me his favorite toy, but there was something almost sinister beneath the surface of that small, innocent face. It was his relentless whining every time I beat him, the way he would stomp his foot and demand I go again, claiming I was cheating as if I were some kind of adult monster trying to ruin his childhood. I tried to laugh it off. I didn't want to diminish a kid's spirit, but when he kept taunting me about how I was never going to beat him at anything ever, I felt that familiar itch to prove a point. It was a calm Saturday evening when I finally snapped. My girlfriend was baking cookies in the other room, and the sweet, chocolatey smell wafted through the air, mixing with Timmy's cries of frustration as I scored yet another winning point. You just let me win, didn't you? He accused, glaring at me with those huge, innocent brown eyes that suddenly didn't seem so innocent, as if the shadows of the dimly lit room were casting a spell that twisted his features into something darker. I took a deep breath, my heart racing as something primal ignited in me, a sudden desire not just to win, but to utterly destroy his confidence right then and there. "No, Timmy, this time it's for real," I said, feeling a surge of energy course through my veins. I wouldn't just let him win, I would crush him, mercilessly. As we picked up the controllers with renewed intensity, I focused my eyes on the screen, which seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, the colors flashing brighter as I dove deeper into the game. I performed moves I didn't even know I had inside me, deftly dodging every attack and countering every strategy he tried to pull. With each round I won, I expected Timmy to laugh or challenge me more fiercely, but the glow of the TV reflected in his gaze as he stared in stunned silence at the pixels that represented his rapidly fading hope. I felt exhilarated, but as his face fell, I also felt a strange chill creeping up my spine. It was as if the house around us was growing colder, the walls whispering tales of the arrogance of pride and the dark side of competition. "I'm not letting you win again, Timmy. This is just how it is, and you need to understand that." The words tasted bitter on my tongue as I said them, and for a moment, guilt washed over me like a cold wave crashing onto the shore of a lonely beach, but I pushed it aside and focused on the screen. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, I turned the game into a dominating disaster for him. I perfected the final move, and just as I hit the game's concluding action, the room was engulfed in darkness. The TV flickered and died, plunging us into an eerie silence, the only sound being the added stream of my own heavy breathing, and I felt every ounce of joy drain from the atmosphere as Timmy sat there trembling, his small hands clenched into fists that shook like leaves caught in a violent storm. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice a whisper as though he was terrified of the answer. I started to reply, but that was when I noticed the lights in the house flickering strangely, almost rhythmically, as if trying to communicate in a language only the children of nightmares could understand. The shadows lengthened, extending across the walls like spectral fingers grasping for something they shouldn't have, and in that moment, I realized that the darkness had not merely consumed the television but had troubled the very foundation of our reality. Timmy's laughter turned into a wheeze as he backed away from me, terror dancing in his features, and I don't know what compelled me from that point on, but I instinctively moved toward him, wanting to make him feel safe, wanting him to understand that I was still in control. When my hand brushed against his shoulder, the air turned heavy, the atmosphere thick with something sinister, something that had been lingering in the corners of the room, waiting for just this moment to reveal itself. I thought I heard whispers, distant and haunting, echoing within my mind, and they sounded alarmingly like Timmy's voice as he gasped and said, "I just wanted to win." And I couldn't help but laugh, a short, nervous chuckle that caught deep in my throat, because it suddenly became clear that this was about more than just winning a game. This had become a matter of life and death. Then he ran. Timmy bolted for the door, screaming his lungs out, but the house felt like it closed in around me, the walls twisting and folding until I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Shadows crawled along the floor like spiders, wrapping their clammy fingers around my ankles as I stumbled forward, trying to follow him, but it was as if the house didn't want me to leave. Then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room in a blinding flash, and there stood Timmy, wide-eyed, as if he had just caught a glimpse of something unspeakably horrifying. Blood drained from my face as dread settled in my stomach. Whatever demon had stirred inside that game was now writhing between us, an unspoken accusation hanging in the air. Are you mad?" he stammered as fear carved lines into his innocent face, and just when I thought I'd backed myself into a corner from which I could never escape, I heard it, an echo of laughter, warped and malevolent, that seemed to seep from the very walls, shaking them with sinister intent. That's when I knew, I had irrevocably broken something inside Timmy, something precious and innocent, and whatever darkness had awakened in that moment was now straining to escape. In that split second, I realized that I wasn't just facing the consequences of my cruel decision, I had unleashed something terrifying, a cruel shadow cast by my own hubris. A cold shiver snaked its way down my spine, as I whispered to Timmy, "I didn't mean for this to happen," but the words felt hollow and the room echoed back with an unsettling refrain, timid yet filled with a knowing horror. We stared into the face of an inexplicable fear, one that bore no physical form yet demanded to be reckoned with, and as I stood there paralyzed, I could almost feel the world fracturing beneath my feet. Those few seconds stretched long and thin, moments filled with understanding that some lines should never be crossed. I knew I needed to do something, to make amends while I could still grasp reality, but just then, Timmy's laughter resumed, only this time it sounded like the crackling of dry leaves underfoot. A boy's giggle turned cruel, echoing from the shadows that had seeped into the corners of the room. I was caught in a web of my own making, shackled by consequences, trapped in a darkness that bore witness to my mistakes, and I was left wondering if I had indeed become the monster in the children's tale I'd once considered so innocent, the very arbiter of nightmares unleashed upon this world in an unthinking act of pride. I never thought a simple plate of brownies could tear my life apart, but then again, nothing about my girlfriend, Lisa, was ever simple. We'd just moved in together after dating for almost a year, and while she was the sweetest person I'd ever met, there were these odd flashes of darkness that occasionally surfaced, like that time I found her staring out the window at the neighbors, grinning eerily, a finger pressed to her lips, and she just muttered something about keeping the family together. I chalked it up to her quirky personality. We all have our weirdness, right? So, when she came home one evening bubbling with excitement, holding a plate of brownies she'd baked from scratch, I genuinely wanted to be thrilled about it, but something felt off. The scent wafting through the apartment was heavenly, rich chocolate mixed with a hint of vanilla, yet it felt tainted with an inexplicable weight. She placed them on the table, her eyes sparkling with anticipation as if they were the manifestation of her love for me, and I wanted to tell her how fantastic they looked, but bile crept up my throat. I hesitated, glancing at her. "I'm not really hungry," I muttered, hoping she'd merely brush it off, but instead, she flared up like a match ignited by the spark of a breath. "You don't like them?" she shouted, and despite the ghostly shadows that danced just beyond her smile, it hit me like a freight train. I'd stepped on hallowed ground. I tried to defend myself, to explain that it was just a lack of appetite and not a reflection of her baking skills, but that only seemed to deepen the frown that replaced her earlier glee. Fighting the sensation of dread gnawing at me, I retreated to my room, needing the safety of solitude to gather my thoughts, but it felt like a prison. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd awakened something I shouldn't have, and as the hours passed, I could hear her moving around in the kitchen, soft mutterings merging with the darkening night. Eventually, sleep dragged me into a nightmare I'd never forget. I saw Lisa standing above me, her face illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight streaming through the window, but there was something unsettling about her smile, something predatory, yet she offered me a brownie, insistent, as the shadows coiled around her in an embrace. I woke with a start, sweat-soaked sheets clinging to my skin, the faintest echo of her whisper still ringing in my ears, a siren's lure, "Just one, darling." When morning came, an overwhelming unease clung to my chest like a weight, and I avoided her gaze over breakfast, worried about how drastically my words had shifted the atmosphere. "Are you sure you don't want to try one?" she asked, a tremor of desperation more than mere sweetness creeping into her tone. "I'll save them for later," I replied vaguely, but I meant it more as a peace offering than genuine interest. However, days turned into weeks, and inevitably, the uneaten brownies loomed like a specter. In the corner of our home, a silent reminder of my supposed ingratitude. The tension crackled like static in the air, thick and almost electric, until one fateful evening, that familiar plate of brownies made a terrifying return. Lisa approached me with a different energy, her smile was tight and her eyes glimmered ominously. "I found a way to make them even better," she declared, and I could hardly recognize the voice coming from her lips. I feigned enthusiasm, but inside, an instinct screamed at me to flee. What could she possibly mean by better? My mind raced, recalling snippets of conversations we had about organic ingredients, the herbs she was so into that I dismissed as harmless eccentricities. I felt the walls closing in around me as she set the plate down and leaned closer, her gaze almost molten. "You're still upset I made them, aren't you?" she asked, the innocent facade peeling away like paint from an old wall. "I'm not ungrateful, Lisa. Really, it was just," she cut me off with a derisive laugh that chilled me to the bone, and suddenly, it all spiraled into a confrontation neither of us wanted but couldn't seem to escape. I screamed something about her obsession with those brownies, how her moods hinged on my reaction to them, and that's when I saw it, a flash of something lurking in her eyes, something dark and consuming. "You don't understand," she hissed, taking a step back, the slight tremor of her voice betraying what brutality lurked beneath. "Once you've tasted my brownies, there's no going back. You'll want more. I promise." The way she smiled made my skin crawl, like a snake licking its lips before it strikes, and I knew then that my refusal was merely a prelude to something horrific. Panic surged. I needed to leave and put distance between myself and the sinister weight of her words. I slammed the door behind me, vowing to never return, but in the night, as darkness crushed the light, her voice followed me. "You'll regret this," she promised, each syllable dripping with malice as I ran into the streets, desperate to escape my own mind. Days turned into nightmares. I could feel her watching me, waiting, as the uneaten brownies sat like a silent curse in the corner of my dreams. Friends grew concerned. I could hardly hold a conversation. Paranoia wrapped me in an icy grip, and I convinced myself that she could sense my fear like a predator stalking prey. I moved in with a friend, but every creak of the floorboards felt like her footsteps trailing me, every shadow reminding me of her wide grin, and those damned brownies flashed in my mind like a harbinger of doom. Then one evening, just as I was curling up on the couch with trembling hands, there was a knock at the door, a seemingly benign sound, yet it sent ice coursing through my veins. I approached cautiously, peeking through the peephole, and there she was, Lisa, standing with that same plate of brownies held against her chest like a shield, her hair wild and disheveled, a manic light in her eyes. "You didn't say goodbye," she said sweetly, and before I could respond, I found myself under the spell of her haunting smile. The door flew open, and I was trapped in that infernal gaze. "I made them for you. Just one, darling, and everything will be all right," she murmured, words curling around me like tendrils of smoke. In that moment, all I could do was stare at the brownies, their dark, glossy surface beckoning me closer, the aroma filling my nostrils with a singular promise: bliss. I swayed slightly, teetering between hunger and fear, but then I saw something in the swirl of chocolate, something darker than mere sweets, something deep and twisted, teeth, shining stark white against the dark backdrop. I stumbled back, horror flooding through me as I realized she hadn't been baking at all but crafting a sinister concoction meant to bind me to her forever. "You'll regret not eating them," she said, her voice reverberating through my entire being, and as I ran, her laughter echoed behind me, melding into the shadows, intertwining with every dark corner of my mind. As I sprinted away from the apartment, I knew then what I had truly awakened. This was her devotion, a sacrifice they didn't tell you about in romantic fairy tales, and there was no way to uneat the brownies I hadn't tasted. They had already taken a piece of me. I never thought refusing to babysit my niece at the last minute would lead to the nightmare that I am now living in. It was supposed to be a quiet Friday night. I had been looking forward to a solo evening binge watching my favorite shows, just curled up in my blanket with a bowl of popcorn, when my sister called. She was in a panicked frenzy because her plans with friends had fallen through at the last minute and she needed someone, anyone, to watch her 8-year-old daughter, Lily. I hesitated, knowing full well that Lily's recent behaviors had made me uncomfortable. In the past few months, she'd been acting strangely, saying odd, almost unsettling things, like how she saw shadows move in the corners of her room or how her dolls would talk to her about things she couldn't possibly have known. I always shrugged it off as childhood imagination or just an overactive mind, but something in my gut twisted at the thought of being alone with her for several hours. "I can't," I finally said, my voice trembling slightly. "I have plans." The voice on the other end didn't take it well. My sister began to plead, insisting that I was being selfish, but I stood my ground. "It's just one night," I thought as I hung up, relieved until I glanced out the window and saw a shadow pass by my front door. It felt ridiculous, I told myself. It was just the wind or some stray cat, maybe even my imagination running wild, but then I heard a light tapping at the glass. I brushed it off as the tree branches swaying in the evening breeze, or maybe just my overactive mind playing tricks on me, until the tapping became a steady knock. My heart raced as I cautiously peeked through the peephole, and for a split second, I saw a small figure standing there, swaying slightly under the porch light. Instinctively, I swung open the door to confront whatever was there, only to see nothing. Just an empty porch, the night air wrapped around me like a heavy cloak. Dismissing everything as some childish prank or a figment of my imagination, I locked the door, shaking my head at my foolishness. I turned back to the TV, trying to immerse myself in the glow of the screen, but kept feeling that sense of dread resting at the back of my mind. As I settled back into the sofa, I convinced myself it was just nerves from the confrontation with my sister. But the unease lingered. I could feel it pressing against my chest, suffocating me as the night dragged on. I decided to distract myself with a few episodes before bed, but just as I'd settled in, my phone buzzed. It was my sister, text after text flooding in. "Please, I'm desperate. Lily's acting strange. I need help. Where are you?" My stomach twisted as I read her frantic messages. I was about to reply when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of giggles, soft and high-pitched, floating from somewhere outside my window. My heart thumped painfully against my rib cage, and I stood up, moving closer to the window to peer out into the darkness. Nothing, just shadows pooling at the foot of the trees in my yard. But then my eyes caught a flash of something pale, and I noticed it wasn't just shadows dancing in the wind, it was Lily, standing at the edge of my lawn, her hair tangled over her face, her little hands clutching her doll, which seemed impossibly larger than her. Panic erupted in my chest as I realized she'd somehow gotten here despite my refusal. I rushed to the door, flinging it open to call out to her, but my voice caught in my throat when I saw her face. She was smiling, and it was wrong, too wide, contorted in a way that felt inhuman, and her eyes glinted in the dark like they were lit from within. "Auntie," she shouted, her voice echoing eerily, sounding less like a child and more like an echo of something dark. "Come play with us." "Us?" I stammered, my stomach churning, but before I could process what was happening, she tilted her head, and the darkness around her seemed to shudder, hundreds of little whispers threading through the air like icy fingers. I realized with gut-wrenching certainty that she wasn't alone. I'd read stories about evil things hiding in the guise of children. I stepped back instinctively, heart racing, but her eyes locked onto mine. They were vacant, swirling like storm clouds. "Don't be scared, Auntie. I've brought my friends," she purred, the shadows behind her deepening and looming closer. Panic coursed through my veins, and I slammed the door, retreating to the safety of my home, my mind spinning with the horror of what I had seen. I tried to convince myself it was just a child's folly, a trick of the light, but the knocking started again, more insistent this time. It wasn't a steady knock, though, it felt like fingers, hundreds, scratching at the door, their whispers creeping through the cracks. I fumbled for my phone, contemplating calling my sister, but what would I say? Her daughter was out there with friends? I needed to think. The second I gathered myself to move toward the kitchen for some water, the lights flickered ominously, plunging me into darkness for a heartbeat before they returned. That was when I heard the unmistakable sound of giggling again, now layered with whispers, words tumbling into one another that sent my heart racing. I had to open the door, reassure Lily somehow, tell her it was all okay, but when I cautiously opened it again, instead of the small child, I was met by a hollow laugh that sent ice through my bones. The porch was empty, yet there was a chill in the air that spoke of menace, something lurking just beyond the light. "Auntie, come out and play," echoed through the night, and my instincts screamed for me to retreat. I could hear my heart hammering in my chest as I shut the door, bolting it securely and retreating further into my home, but I could still feel those eyes, those countless eyes watching through the dark, just waiting. I stumbled through the hallway to find a weapon, anything that could offer me a sense of security, when I noticed something on the floor. A small shadow lay near my feet, casting an impossible silhouette on the wall. It was Lily's doll, the one she always carried, its glassy eyes glittering even in the dim light. I recoiled in horror as the whispers intensified, now clearer and rising to a frenzy. "She's not yours anymore. We want her home. Come out, come out." They wrapped around my thoughts, making me feel warm, comfortable, even as dread clawed at my throat. I couldn't let them have her. Suddenly, the lamps flickered, casting chaotic shadows across the room, bringing to life dark silhouettes that danced on the walls. Just when I thought the chaos had reached its peak, a chorus of giggles rang out, echoing all around me. I knew I had to act before it was too late. Rushing to the back door, I grabbed my jacket and flung it on, preparing to face whatever awaited in the dark. But the sounds grew louder, almost jubilant, a cacophony of twisted mirth that echoed through the hall. I gripped the handle and swung the door open, ready to confront whatever shadowy monstrosity awaited, but all I found was the glassy-eyed doll sitting on my step, its pale face turned towards me, grinning, with Lily's giggles chiming in the air. "You can't escape us, Auntie. We're already home." That's when I knew I had made the wrong decision. I choked on my breath, realizing that in refusing to watch my niece, I had invited terror into my life, and the very shadows I thought I'd escaped were now closing in, the whispers wrapping around me, claiming me for their own. AITA for suggesting my teacher host my son's party at her house? It all started innocently enough. My son Ethan had turned 8, and in the excitement of planning his birthday party, I wanted to make it unforgettable. After all, this was the age where friendships began to solidify, and I wanted Ethan to feel special. I had toyed with the idea of renting a hall or throwing a backyard barbecue, but nothing felt quite right. It needed a personal touch, something more intimate. That's when I remembered Ms. Keller, Ethan's third-grade teacher, who had been nothing short of extraordinary. She had a way of bringing magic into mundane lessons, turning math classes into treasure hunts and history into exciting adventures, and I thought, why not? It was a bit of a stretch, but her massive Victorian-style house, filled with books and nooks, could be the perfect backdrop for a meaningful gathering. I approached her after school one day, my heart pounding in my chest, and suggested it as a wild idea. To my surprise, she considered it. Her smile softened into something more contemplative, as she brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear and nodded thoughtfully, but she never agreed. Weeks passed, and the conversation slipped from memory until I received a text from her, asking if I wanted to meet for coffee, where she revealed she had been thinking about hosting the party at her house after all, citing how her own children loved the space. My heart soared. It was the answer I'd dreamed of, and I quickly agreed. The days leading up to the party were filled with excitement and anticipation. Every time Ethan smiled or laughed, I felt like I was on top of the world, relishing the fact that my crazy idea had manifested into reality. Then, the night of the party came. The kids flooded into Ms. Keller's grand home, laughter echoed through her hallways, filled with the sweet scent of homemade cookies and the sound of balloons popping. I was caught up in a whirlwind of joy, glancing at Ms. Keller, who seemed to glide effortlessly between the children, her voice a gentle breeze among the giggles, until everything took a strange turn. Around 9, when half the kids were exhausted, I noticed Ethan drifting toward the basement door, which was slightly ajar, hesitant fingers reaching for the handle. "Ethan, no." I called out, the warning tearing from my lips as I rushed toward him, a sudden chill creeping into my veins. Ms. Keller was right behind me, her smile flickering as she gently reprimanded him, offering a promise of games and laughter above, but the glint in her eyes turned steely for the briefest second, sending a shiver crawling up my spine. I dismissed the incident, attributing my unease to exhaustion, and helped set up the cake. But the atmosphere thickened as the night wore on, the joyous laughter stagnant against an ill wind that seemed to seep in from nowhere. I watched as one by one, the children began to act strangely. They would pause mid-laugh, eyes wide as if something had whispered their names. The cake remained untouched, and the adults murmured amongst themselves, glancing nervously at the basement door that somehow drew attention like a gaping maw ready to swallow the unwary. It creaked open again, and I lost my breath when I saw tiny shadows moving in the dimness, figures that looked like children but were all wrong, limbs out of proportion, faces stretched or twisted in unnatural ways. One child, my neighbor's son, stumbled back up the stairs and pointed a trembling finger toward the door, and I suddenly realized none of the kids had gone in, but rather, something had come out. Ms. Keller quickly ushered them away, her demeanor shifting, sternness painting her features. I was struck by a sense of dread deeper than fear. I fumbled for my phone, frantically attempting to call the police when Ms. Keller approached, an unsettling calm settling over her. "Everything's fine, really," she said, her voice smooth like honey but edged with steel. "Just let them play." Then she looked beyond me and smiled, but I could feel it, a wave of malevolence rolling off her as the basement door creaked open wider, and a chilling breeze clawed at my back. Panic bubbled up inside me as I gripped Ethan's arm and started toward the door, but the children were transfixed, eyes locked on the darkness below. "You're being silly," Ms. Keller whispered with a hint of irritation, glancing over at the basement while the lights flickered ominously. "They just want to play a game." I felt the icy grip of dread tighten around me. The playfulness of the party had warped into something grotesque, as if the children were entranced by the shadowed figures whispering promises they could not resist. I turned and bolted for the door, dragging Ethan with me, but behind me, I could hear Ms. Keller's sweet voice laced with something sinister. "Ethan, we have so much more fun to have down here," she beckoned, her tone shifting like the wind, and everything in me screamed to flee. I yanked him toward the exit just as chaos erupted. The children screamed, not in delight but in pure terror as the twisted forms slinked further into the light, and the laughter turned into shrieks. I burst through the front door, practically tearing Ethan into the night as the darkness behind me stirred, shadows swirling like tempests through Ms. Keller's home. The last thing I saw before slamming the door shut was her eyes, two glimmering voids that seemed to absorb both light and life. We didn't stop running until we reached our car parked at the end of the street, panting and gasping as I shoved Ethan into the passenger seat, fumbling for my keys. It wasn't until we were far away, the glow of Ms. Keller's charming house in the distance, that I dared to glance at him, and when I did, everything felt wrong. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but a strange, otherworldly calm, and I realized with dawning horror that he had begun to mimic the same expression I had seen on those twisted children. I glanced back at him, trying to shake off the terror, desperate to hold on to the warmth of normalcy, and as the night deepened around us, doubt crept in. Did I just ruin my son's birthday, or had I unwittingly invited something far worse? I shuddered thinking of Ms. Keller, now a blend of menace and charm, waiting at the edge of darkness for another innocent soul, and with each mile, a single thought screamed in my mind: was this all my fault? When my in-laws announced their planned visit, I had mixed feelings. Their last visit had left me exhausted, and their habit of criticizing my parenting and my home loomed large in my mind, so I decided to child-proof our house even more than usual. It felt necessary, not just for my peace but also for the safety of my 3-year-old daughter, Ava, who could turn any mundane object into a weapon of chaos. I began with the basics: outlet covers, strapping the heavy bookshelf to the wall, and locking away any potentially harmful items. But as I rummaged through the cabinets for anything that might hand my in-laws an excuse to criticize, I stumbled upon an old shoebox filled with knickknacks from my childhood. Inside, I found an ornate porcelain figurine that my mother had insisted on keeping in the living room, a delicate ballet dancer with a lifted dress and pointed toes, fragile yet hauntingly beautiful. A chill ran down my spine at the thought of Ava breaking at the moment Grandma laid eyes on it. So, I tucked it away in the attic, convinced it was the responsible thing to do. In the weeks that followed, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every corner, every shelf was scrutinized. I installed more baby gates than I could count and even placed breathable netting over our balcony railing. It was excessive, but I wanted to avoid the shame of an "I told you so" from my in-laws, should the worst happen. The night before their arrival, I barely slept. My mind raced, plagued by visions of what might go wrong: a splinter, a bruise, or worse, an injury. When the morning came, I was a bundle of nerves, jumping at every sound. As I sat in anxious silence with Ava, the doorbell rang. The moment my in-laws stepped inside, my stomach twisted. I could see my father-in-law's judgmental gaze scanning our living room, taking in the extra safety measures, dissecting them with quiet disdain. But a part of me felt triumphant because I felt like I'd done my part to protect my daughter. They greeted Ava with a syrupy sweetness that made me even more uneasy. As the day progressed, my in-laws prattled on about their lives in the city, how much better things were there, and I bit my tongue to hold back a million retorts about the pressures of city living. Their comments turned to parenting advice before long, filled with passive-aggressive suggestions that sent my blood pressure soaring. I steered them away from danger zones. The balcony is off-limits, because of the netting. But they insisted that Ava could handle it. And then I heard it, a soft, yet unmistakable sound from above. The attic. I felt a sense of dread wash over me. Could my daughter have found a way up? I excused myself, my heart racing, and bounded upstairs 2 steps at a time, convinced I'd find her playing among the cobwebs. The attic door creaked open, and I stepped into the dim light, expecting to find calamity awaiting. Instead, I was met only with silence. My eyes scanned the room, landing on the old shoebox, a single beam of light catching on the porcelain dancer. But when I approached, my hand brushed against a pile of items hidden beneath a dust-covered blanket, and I froze. It was personal stuff, my old toys, and also something that wasn't mine, a rusted knife, half buried beside an old doll. I recoiled, backing away, but the moment did send chills through me. Why on earth was a knife up here? Just as I took a breath to regain my composure, a loud crash echoed downstairs. I bolted down the stairs, the whisper of dread trailing behind me. Upon entering the living room, I nearly fainted. Ava sat on the floor amidst the ruins of a table lamp, her wide eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and pure delight. My in-laws were glaring at her, my mother-in-law shielding her mouth in horror as my father-in-law reached for the phone to call someone. I panicked. "It's just a lamp," I practically screamed, gripping Ava as she chimed in cheerfully, obliviously proud of her little escapade. "Look, Mommy, I knocked it over." But my mother-in-law wasn't done. She launched into a tirade about how I needed to control my child, the implications of an uncluttered house cutting deeper than the knife I'd found. I felt my heart racing in my chest, rage bubbling over as I snapped back. "I'm just trying to keep her safe." "Is that a crime?" The air thickened with tension, words spilling out like toxic waste. Ava whimpered as the shouting echoed around her, turning her giggles into tears. My memory of the rusted knife clawed at me, whispering the dangers lurking in the corners of parental responsibility. The in-laws left that day under a cloud of disappointment that carried through the air like a death knell. After they left, I turned to Ava, feeling more defeated than ever. It was just a table lamp, but I could sense too much had been awakened. That night, I found myself back in the attic, drawn to the violated innocence of my childhood treasures. I didn't care that I was scaring myself, I needed to understand why someone would have hidden that knife. As I pulled the doll from the pile, I was unprepared for the sight of something I'd never noticed before, stitched into the fabric, a single word in fading thread: help. The letters blurred together until a memory from so long ago slapped me in the face. It was my mother's warning, a phrase I hadn't thought about since childhood, a nondescript caution about strangers, but I had dismissed it then, just as I had dismissed the weird unease my in-laws always stirred within me. Parental instincts, they say, are born through fear, but I realized my fear ran deeper this time. The knife, the warnings, the porcelain dancer, it all fit into a secret puzzle of silence that I thought had been long forgotten. Suddenly, the mundane act of child-proofing my house felt like a wake-up call to a monstrous reality. I climbed back down, determined but unnerved. Nothing else mattered now, I had to protect Ava. The old fears returned in waves, whispering the awful truth that sometimes, the real dangers come not from our children, but from the shadows we inadvertently bring into our lives. And as I stood guard at Ava's bedroom door that night, listening to her soft breathing, I felt the eerie sensation of being watched, as if the shadows were deliberating, waiting for an opportunity to rise. The next time my in-laws planned a visit, I'd have to make a choice: would I child-proof against the world, or would I prepare for the secrets that hid behind the look of disappointment on their faces? Growing up, I always knew I was different from the other kids in my town. While most families seemed whole and uncomplicated, my reality was a patchwork quilt of half-truths and familial tensions, my parents' marriage a fragile thing that shattered when I was just 15. It was then that my mom revealed to me the existence of my half-sister, Lily, a product of my dad's affair, and though I initially felt a strange sort of sympathy for her, that empathy twisted and hardened as years went by. With my mother constantly torn between her loyalty to our bloodline and the shame her husband's infidelity brought upon us, she began to favor Lily, at least in the subtler, unmeasured ways: an extra scoop of ice cream at parties, bonus minutes spent in delighted conversation that I never seemed to earn. It came to a head when my mother decided to gift Lily our family's most prized heirloom, a delicate silver necklace adorned with a single emerald, which had belonged to my grandmother and was said to carry the blessings of strength and resilience. That summer evening, as I stood there aghast, Lily grinning in delighted astonishment while my heart pounded like a war drum echoing betrayal through my veins, I felt my chest constrict with such a mix of emotions: rage, contempt, and something jaggedly sharp that I'd only admit to myself years later: a deep, gnawing sense of loss. I told her she didn't deserve it, the words spilling out of my mouth like venom, and for a moment the air was thick with a silence that amplified the quiet sobs my mother stifled. In an instant, Lily's joy was crushed under the weight of my accusation, her face paling. "You don't even know me," she retorted, but the words cut deeper than any knife, and for a fleeting moment, I saw irritation fuse with sadness in her eyes. Everything spiraled after that. My mom refused to talk to me, her disappointment a tangible cloud that enveloped our home, wrapping itself so tightly around me that I suffocated in shame. I convinced myself I was right, that I was standing up for the sanctity of our family line, not to mention my grandmother's memory, but every day that dragged into weeks left a bitter residue on my soul, and Lily was the ghost haunting me wherever I went until one nameless, starlit night I found myself on my way to meet her, a stupid impulse driving me forward like a moth to a flame, thinking maybe, just maybe, I could mend the frayed edges of the relationship I sabotaged so recklessly. Lily lived in an old Victorian that smelled of mildew and neglect, her laughter once light-hearted now tinged with a hardness that spoke of years spent being a shadow, always outshined by a bone-deep allure of a necklace she knew would never belong to her. She opened the door with hesitation, and I noticed the way her eyes flickered with a cocktail of surprise and cautious hope. "What do you want?" she asked, but the sharpness of her tone melted the moment she caught sight of the little box I held closely, the very one my mother had used to gift her that damned necklace. "I'm sorry," I stuttered, feeling the weight of my words evaporate in the cool night air. "I wanted you to have it, because it's not the necklace that matters, it's what it represents, the love and connection that comes with it." Yet as I held out the small box, Lily's expression shifted, confusion wrinkles furrowing her brow. "You're just saying that because of Mom," she whispered, bitterness flowing through every syllable, making me realize how wrong I was to believe that a simple apology would eclipse the years of resentment we shared. But then, she surprised me, her eyes softening as she slowly reached for the box, delicate fingers trembling, and I felt a warm swell in my chest. For a moment, we exchanged something sacred, a flicker of that sisterly bond that had been buried in the rubble of our complicated heritage. But in the back of my mind, a plaguing thought lingered: what if the real ghost that was haunting me wasn't the fractured family ties but rather what lay inside that necklace box? As the night unfolded, and shadows danced across her living room, something broke in me when I finally said, "It's cursed." Lily laughed, a sound that echoed against the walls, disbelief sparkling in her eyes, but I persisted, recounting the whispers I'd heard, the warnings passed down through years, that the necklace held a dark secret. My grandmother had insisted on wearing it every single day until her last breath, her slow decline a shadowed testimony to its malevolence. That revelation hung in the air like a lightning storm, and I hoped the curse would shatter the moment, expose any fragile connection we had. But when Lily pulled the necklace from its velvet resting place, I swear I felt the temperature drop as darkness unfurled around us, an unsettling whisper brushing through the air, weaving itself through the tension. "You think I can't handle it?" she challenged, heart blazing with defiance, and my stomach dropped as I caught her twisting the delicate chain around her neck, the emerald glimmering ominously at the hollow of her throat. The lights flickered, shadows growing long and distorted, stretching across the room, and I felt as if I was standing at the edge of a precipice as dread unfurled like a storm. I approached her cautiously, my heart racing, assuring her it was just an old wives' tale, but the moment she pressed her fingertips against the cool emerald, my voice was drowned out by a rumble, the ground beneath us trembling. Suddenly, with a crash, the windows shattered violently, a gust of icy wind rushing in, a fury unleashed. I screamed for her to take it off, but she stood there, frozen, eyes wide with a mix of terror and exhilaration, a new kind of laughter spilling from her lips that sent chills down my spine. In that instant, I knew we were no longer searching for forgiveness, nor sisterhood, but rather that darkness was claiming her, just as it had claimed our grandmother. The necklace now tangled around her like a malevolent snake, it began to glow with an ethereal light, and as the horrifying truth dawned on me, I realized I didn't just destroy our family's legacy, I unleashed a haunting that neither of us could escape. It was too late for apologies now. With a heartbreaking resolve, I rushed towards her, desperate to rip it away, but unearthly sounds erupted from the shadows, screeching and wailing, a cacophony promising suffering, promising that we had both become part of something far beyond our understanding. The necklace glowed brighter, swallowing her whole as Lily screamed, an echo of anger, fear, and, above all, despair, before she simply vanished, the necklace spiraling into darkness as my heart shattered. I stumbled back, gasping, the world around me disassembling into chaos as I realized, the truth was never about deserving the necklace, it was about the curse that tethered us both to the ghosts of our past, and in my heart, I knew I would forever carry the weight of what happened that night, a sister still lost to the shadows, the necklace a constant reminder that in this twisted story, no one was truly innocent and I was left haunted by the question, Ida, for telling my half-sister she didn't deserve my mom's necklace? Last summer, my friend Brian dared me to jump on his new trampoline after school, but I just shrugged it off, claiming I wasn't in the mood. Honestly, I felt a strange unease whenever I went near it, as if it were more of a portal than a simple backyard attraction. Brian was relentless, teasing me about being scared and insisting that it was perfectly safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You see, he had gotten that trampoline the previous weekend, almost impulsively, after attending a yard sale that offered it for a steal because the family was moving away quickly. As I tried to walk away from his persistent offers, I overheard Brian mention something about how the trampoline seemed alive to his little brother, Timmy, who was only 5 and had already developed this eerie attachment to it. I chuckled nervously, brushing off the remark, but later that night, I heard Timmy's laughter drifting into my window, and the sound was oddly distorted, a kind of echoing giggle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I told Brian about it the next day, he downplayed it, saying Timmy was just being a kid. Still, I couldn't help but remember the murmurings I had heard from the other kids at school, whispers about the last owners of that trampoline, the couple who vanished without a trace, leaving their house in disarray and their yard littered with the remnants of a normal family life. As days turned into weeks, and each day brought an increasing intensity of Timmy's obsession with the trampoline, I became more uneasy. I could often see him out there, springing into the air, laughing uncontrollably as if the trampoline was buoying him to new heights of joy. But every now and then, he would stop mid-jump, tilting his head as if listening to something from the shadows of their large oak tree. Finally, one late afternoon, I relented and agreed to join Brian and Timmy. As I climbed onto the trampoline, the surface felt unnaturally warm under my feet, almost pulsing, like it had a heartbeat. I tried to force a smile, bouncing gently, but that sensation of unease returned tenfold. It wasn't fear of falling, it was an instinctive dread that clawed at my stomach, warning me to get out before it was too late. Within minutes, Timmy returned to jumping, his laughter now edging towards something sinister. He would occasionally stop, staring wide-eyed at the ground, and that's when it hit me. I couldn't quite tell if he was laughing or if he was being called to something I couldn't see, a siren song that made him float just a little too close to the edge of sanity. That night, I lay in my bed, tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that the trampoline had changed something in Timmy. It wasn't just a plaything anymore. I can't explain it rationally, but I started having dreams, vivid and grotesque, dreams of wide-open spaces and crooked shadows, of children jumping in circles, their laughter resonating into an empty abyss. I woke in a cold sweat, and when I glanced out the window, there was Timmy again, bouncing on the trampoline beneath the pallid light of the moon, but this time, it was just him, alone, with that faint aura of something in the air, a palpable tension simmering beneath the surface. By the end of that week, Timmy's parents pulled him away from the trampoline, claiming it was time for bed. But I knew better. I could see how the glow of the moonlight dimmed to a dull hue, the energy changing palpably as their home became quieter. The very next morning, though, I was jolted awake by the sound of frantic knocks on my door. It was Brian, panting and wide-eyed. He said Timmy had vanished from his room, and the last time anyone saw him, he had been headed toward the trampoline. My heart raced as we sprinted down the street, the sun glaring down unforgivingly, making our urgency feel desperate. As we neared the house, I could sense an oppressive aura surrounding that backyard, as if the air itself was warning me. We found Timmy standing still on the trampoline, fully awake, staring deeply into the air above him. Brian called out to him, but there was no response. He didn't even blink. I felt paralyzed. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced with a heavy silence that froze the bone. I grabbed Brian and pulled him back as I gasped for breath. I suddenly realized that Timmy looked older, his little face somehow transformed by the week's events. Then, just like that, he jumped. And kept going. Higher and higher, defying all laws of gravity, until he reached an impossible altitude, hovering suspended in midair with a glint of wild joy in his eyes, a dark and glittering promise that horrified me. "Timmy, get down," Brian shouted in desperation as I felt my stomach drop. Something was terribly wrong. Timmy turned and held out a tiny hand, as if inviting us to join him in that eerie state of bliss, but it was too late. Before we could comprehend what was happening, he was swallowed by a cloud of shadows that erupted from the edges of the trampoline, swallowing the sunlight and everything with it, leaving us standing breathless on a hollow lot, gasping at the absence of laughter where there once was pure childhood joy. I was left haunted by the thought that I had refused to jump that day, that despite my instincts screaming at me to stay away from that thing, I did nothing to protect Timmy. I watched as Brian collapsed to his knees, screaming for his brother in desperation, while I stood rooted on the ground, knowing the truth that I could never share, that sometimes, the thrill of the jump is a gateway to something darker, something that doesn't want to be found. Weeks passed, but the trampoline remained there, a grim reminder of our stupidity, our refusal to listen to instinct rather than the shrieking laughter of a child that felt all too inviting. To this day, I wonder if giving in would have turned the tides, if perhaps Timmy and I could have escaped those sinister depths together, but now, all I hear is the echo of his laughter from the lifeless backyard, making me question, was I truly the idiot for not jumping on that trampoline? When my cousin Morgan invited me to her graduation party, I was excited but also apprehensive. She had always been the golden child, and I never really measured up. So when I discovered through a mutual friend that she'd actually paid her way through an online diploma mill, a secret she vehemently tried to keep under wraps, I felt compelled to confront her in a way I never had before. As I arrived at the lavishly decorated backyard where Instagram-ready balloons floated like pastel clouds and a makeshift wooden stage awaited the valedictorian speech, I saw Morgan basking in the glow of attention, glamorous in her cap and gown, but something about her smile felt rehearsed, a facade that cracked when I caught her in a whispered conversation with her mother, her eyes betraying a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of the dread that shadowed her achievement. The tension spiraled as I witnessed her proudly accepting faux accolades from family members who knew nothing about the truth, their hearts too eager to embrace the lie she had spun, and despite my reservations, I found myself standing closer than I should have, caught in a tide of bitter resentment and the sinking realization that the very fabric of our familial love was woven by deception. When the moment arrived, and the spotlight danced its way to me, I felt a surge of jealousy threaten to overthrow my sanity as I grasped the microphone, and almost involuntarily, I blurted out, "Congratulations, Morgan. But I guess it's not my fault you bought your degree." The gasps were audible, a sharp intake of air that split the warm afternoon like thunder, and Morgan's expression shifted instantly from shock to rage, the kind that transformed her cherubic face into a monstrous reflection of pure betrayal. Struggling to maintain my composure under the onslaught of disdainful glares from shocked relatives, I felt a rush of adrenaline, knowing I had thrown a match into a sea of dry kindling. It was a chaotic flurry of shouting voices and clattering utensils, her mother gasping as if I had slapped her across the face. Morgan lunged at me, fists flying, but I didn't back down. My voice echoed like a battle cry as I shouted back about the years spent on her high horse while I worked hard for every scrap of recognition I ever got. The guests' faces were a grim collage of disappointment and concern as Morgan choked back tears and accused me of ruining her day, insisting that our family's blood and humor had always been worth celebrating, but I stood firm in my accusation, questioning the very essence of her achievement, a hyena's laugh punctuating the tension as I pointed to her stack of ceremony photos where every smile seemed to mock the truth, and in that moment, her mask slipped away entirely, revealing the dread underneath. The argument devolved into an exhibition of dirty laundry dragged through the sunshine, where her past transgressions and insecurities collided with my burdens, creating an intangible fissure between us that I feared could never be mended, all eyes piercing through me with an intensity I had never felt before, until suddenly, an older relative stepped in, an uncle I hadn't spoken to in years, who claimed to know everything, or at least our family folklore, and in that uncanny silence that followed his boisterous entry, I realized I wasn't alone in feeling weighed down by each lie we had ever entertained. It seemed there were whispers buried beneath the layers of our gatherings, and somehow I had exposed an unseen reality that shook the very roots of our idyllic narratives, and as the evening devolved into something grotesque, I felt the atmosphere shift as Morgan's confidence withered, beaten down by the harsh glare of scrutiny while our relatives circled her like vultures, waiting for her to admit her mistake amidst the chaos I had ignited. Days melted into nights, turning that party into a cursed memory, an echo reverberating in my mind where guilt twisted with vindication. I became the antagonist in my family's story, labeled as the villain who dared to expose the truth in the face of a flawless facade, while Morgan slipped deeper into denial, swaddled by the lies she had built her life upon until her phone began buzzing like a hornet's nest. Yet the only messages I received were warnings from friends out of fear of family repercussions for having spoken my mind. A week later, I awoke to a world shimmering with silence. The calls from my family had ceased, the chatter turned hollow, and every gathering near my doorstep became a reminder of the rift I had created, until Morgan's mother called me with that threatening tone, implying that I had pulled the curtain on a family scandal too sinister to ignore and told me that if I valued our relationship at all, I would confess and apologize, but I staunchly held my ground, knowing deep down our world was riddled with secrets worth preserving. But as tension morphed into shadows, something shifted in the air. Whispers followed me through the streets as eye contact became a dangerous commodity among family, where every encounter felt like a trial for my transgressions, and one particularly lonely night, as I sat on my porch nursing regrets, Morgan appeared without warning, her eyes clouded with uncertainty but her resolve sparked like wildfire. The once inseparable bond now lay ruptured, festering wounds of jealousy and betrayal threatening to drown any flicker of hope. She confessed that she had lived in fear, unable to tell anyone the truth about how she felt trapped in the mirage of success she had crafted, the facade becoming a noose as constricting as the expectations her mother thrust upon her. I watched her as she broke down, everything she personified crumbling into a cascade of tears. I thought this vulnerability might grant us the catharsis needed, but instead, the revelation left a bitter taste that thickened the already toxic atmosphere. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere thickened with dread, but I could not shake the feeling that I had unleashed something dark and vast into our lives. But it wasn't until Morgan threatened to seek her truth among strangers and let the world see what lay beneath our collective skin, that I understood how fragile our positions were. Each word we exchanged now felt like blades sharp enough to cleave the very fabric of our belonging, and I wondered if I had become the architect of my own isolation, torn between the vindication of honesty and the warmth of denial that had wrapped us like a cocoon for too long. When the day finally dawned, bright yet oppressive, I found myself spiraling, the daylight harsh against my regret as Morgan prepared to reveal all on social media. My heart pounded like a war drum, my vision tunneled in on the inevitable pain, but when she finally pressed send, I was left gasping in shock as the floodgates opened. Those who had smiled at her celebration turned into virtual haters, cloaked in anonymity yet wielding their venom like knives as they punctured her facade, leaving Morgan in the ruins of her own making, shattered pieces drifting away as their words became anchors that dragged her deeper into despair. In the aftermath, as relatives distanced themselves and the truth morphed into its own gelatinous monster, I wondered whether I had been right all along or merely too cowardly to save us from the inevitable. And as Morgan sat in a self-constructed prison of hate and sorrow, I learned through the lens of my own brokenness that sometimes, saying the hard truth reveals scars too deep to heal, leaving behind a silence that echoes louder than any shout of victory could ever hope to drown. I was never the kind of person who took pleasure in stirring the pot, but the strange events that unfolded on my parents' land last autumn left me questioning everything I thought I knew about our little corner of the world, and myself. You see, every morning, I'd take my dog, Max, for a stroll along the well-trodden paths through the woods behind our house, an area usually filled with the comforting sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls, but October was different. The chill in the air held an edge, and the atmosphere turned thick with tension. Hunting season had begun, and with it came whispers of unease among the townsfolk. My parents warned me to steer clear of the usual hunting spots, but to be honest, I thought they were overreacting. After all, this was our family land, and what right did a couple of hunters have to dictate where I could walk my dog? 2 weeks into October, as orange leaves fluttered down like nature's confetti, I decided to ignore my parents' cautious advice. It was a crisp Saturday morning when I leashed up Max and headed out towards the back trails. I felt empowered, determined to reclaim my daily ritual, but as we strolled deeper into the woods, a creeping sensation clawed at my spine. Maybe it was just unease from my parents' warnings, maybe it was simple instinct, but something felt off. The woods suddenly seemed alive with unspoken secrets. My heart raced as we rounded a bend in the path and I noticed a tree stand, a crude wooden platform nestled high among the branches of an ancient oak, unmoving but for the sway of the tree. Something made me hesitate as I scanned the area, watching. An irrational part of me considered turning back, but then I saw him, a figure clad in camo, sitting stoically within the confines of the stand, a hunting rifle resting against his knee. He didn't seem to notice us at first, but as I pulled Max closer, I caught a glimpse of what lay beneath that camouflage. His eyes, cold and calculating, focused sharply on me. My skin prickled as the tension in the air intensified, and Max whimpered beside me, ever the sensitive companion. I made the snap decision to keep walking, hoping that if I ignored him, he would do the same. I felt foolish, but it was just a tree stand and a hunter. I had every right to be there. Yet, no sooner had we strolled past the tree than a sharp snap echoed through the quiet woods, like a twig being crushed underfoot. My heart dropped into my stomach. I turned to see the hunter had shifted slightly, almost as if he were adjusting his grip on the rifle, but something felt incredibly wrong. There was a predatory quality to his calm demeanor, a languid patience, like a lion sizing up an unsuspecting gazelle. I picked up the pace, clenching the leash tighter as a wave of primal fear washed over me. Max trotted beside me, seemingly sensing the change in energy, his tail low and his ears alert. I didn't dare look back. I was on my parents' land, I reminded myself again and again, but it was no longer comforting. The sensation of being hunted kept gnawing at my thoughts, and dread mingled with the crisp autumn air as every snap of a twig sent my pulse racing. Just before we reached the clearing, a voice called out, gravelly and low, shattering the suffocating silence and sending a jolt through my body. Hey! You shouldn't be here. It was the hunter. I could feel his eyes boring into my back as I quickened my pace toward the fence that marked the boundaries of our property. This area's reserved. Get lost. I didn't stop or respond, my pulse hammering in my ears, and then, impossibly, I heard a low chuckle, a sound so sinister it might as well have been a growl. That chuckle echoed in my mind long after it faded into the distance, and with it, a realization began to settle like a weight in my chest. I was in danger far beyond what I'd anticipated. I reached the boundary of our land and felt the familiar relief wash over me, but when I turned back, instinctively looking for trouble, the tree stand seemed impossibly empty. There was no sign of him. It was as if he had melted away into the shadows of the woods. I didn't sleep well that night. Shadows from where my dreams should have been stalked me, wrestling me deeper into a pit of anxiety. The next day I tried to explain to my parents, but they waved my concerns away as the ramblings of a paranoid child. People are just doing their thing, my father said over breakfast. You know how the hunters can get. But I had seen something that twisted at the seams of what normal meant. My instincts screamed at me to stay away from the woods, but part of me felt stubbornly drawn back. I needed to confront whatever specter hovered in those trees. The following weekend, I donned my bravest face and headed out again, this time brimming with anger rather than trepidation. Max was at my side once more as we traversed the path, though I felt every heartbeat thrumming through my veins like a war drum. I glanced towards that tree stand, convinced that somehow, impossibly, he was watching me again. You hear me? I shouted into the forest, the bravado masking the fear lacing through me. You can't scare me off my own land. Silence hung, and though my voice rang back at me, I knew I wasn't alone. The shadows felt thicker, and the chill surging through the air seeped right to my bones. It became a twisted game between us. I walked the path, the sense of being hunted curling around me like a predator, watching, waiting. This went on for weeks, each time edging further and further from rationality, caught in the throes of an unnameable dread. Days turned to weeks and the hunter became more than just an encounter. He was a specter, a nightmare made manifest. I would see him in fleeting glimpses through the trees, a flash of camouflage here, a flicker of movement there. The forest became a stage of lurking terror, and one fateful day, with the sun dipping low and shadows elongating, I finally snapped. I took Max and charged across the clearing directly towards the stand, feeling reckless and defiant. Show yourself, I yelled, hands shaking, ready to face whatever darkness awaited me. Those cold eyes finally met mine from the lofty height above. He emerged, stepping lightly down, and for the first time, I could see his face, gaunt and unshaven, with a smile that didn't look human, a predatory grin laced with a chaotic glint. Mighty brave of you to come here, he rasped, his voice dripping with a chilling amusement. You think you have more claim to this land than I do? Panic exploded in my gut, overwhelming my ability to reason as I took a step backward, but my dog growled, stepping protectively in front of me. I pressed on instinctively wanting to protect him as well. This is my family's land, I spat, though doubts gnawed at my resolve. You're nothing but a trespasser. Each word sliced through the air like a knife, but he merely laughed, dark and unrelenting. I've seen you walking here, dog and all. You think I just go away because you're here? This is my haunt now. The way he said haunt struck a chord deep within. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't turn my back on this monster. You don't own this place, I rotated, letting anger guide me through fear, and you're not welcome here. His smile widened, a rictus that hung heavy in the air like some malevolent omen. You think you can keep me away? He snarled dangerously, and that puzzle that had haunted me weeks fell into place. This wasn't just about hunting, it was a war over territory, dominance, the very essence of survival. I knew I had to escape, that lingering fear curling around my throat as I found a moment of doubt. He was just a hunter, surely he wouldn't cross any lines? But just then, the echo of footsteps drew near, and I turned to see my parents coming down the path. Relief flooded through me until I saw the confusion in their eyes. What's going on? My father called, but the hunter merely cocked his head, an utterly soulless look in his gaze. This land should have been theirs long ago, he whispered venomously, but sometimes, the strong take what they want. I felt my breath seize in my throat, I didn't know what I could do. He might have been a man, but he loomed larger than life, a specter of dread that had haunted my every waking moment. Run, I shouted at my parents, desperately trying to shield them as panic clawed at my chest, but they were rooted, fear had snagged them as much as it had ensnared me. What are you doing? My mother cried, but that devil's grin sucked the breath from my lungs. I turned to Max, and as if sensing the impending danger, the little dog barked furiously, a fierce protector as he lunged toward the figure that towered over us. And in that instant, I knew, I wasn't the only one he wanted to claim. Everything twisted around me then, screams pierced the stillness as my mind spiraled into chaos, fragmenting like an old, broken mirror, clawing back toward the safety of the woods I had defended in the first place. But what had once felt like refuge now echoed with the sinister knowledge that the hunter would always be hungering for more. As night fell, my parents finally understood, and I was left racing while the woods closed in behind us, a chilling reminder that in this game of survival, sometimes stepping forward meant crossing a line you could never uncross. We might have escaped with our lives, but the terror of that encounter clings to me still, a constant reminder of the haunting truth. Sometimes, it's not just the land that gets claimed, but our very own sanity that follows suit. And every now and then, when the wind howls just right, I can still hear that terrible laughter echoing through the woods, reminding me that I wasn't just trespassing on land but wandering into a realm where the hunter never really stops hunting. I didn't know the trouble I was stirring when I casually mentioned the inappropriate comment made by my brother-in-law, so let me start from the beginning. I'll never forget the night we sat in my sister's living room, the warmth of the fireplace filling the space as laughter echoed between us. My boyfriend, James, was making some joke that transformed into a hesitant silence when my Bill walked in, his eyes shifting too quickly away from me. It was a regular family gathering until he leaned towards me, mouth curling into a smirk, and whispered something that sent chills down my spine. "You know, I can make you feel better than your boyfriend ever could." I laughed it off as a crude joke, but deep down, the weight of those words anchored in my chest like a stone. I didn't tell anyone, didn't want to ruin the night, and with a glass of wine in hand, I pretended like it never happened, but that smirk lingered in my mind, a ghost that would haunt me into sleepless nights. Days turned into weeks, and I could feel the tensions rising around the dinner table. My sister noticed that something was off, that I was quieter than usual, and James seemed to pick up on it too, his confusion morphing into concern. One evening, we found ourselves alone on the couch, the softness of the moment washing over me, and it spiraled out before I could catch my breath. I confessed to James what my Bill had said, thinking it would make him angry and protective, but instead, his face drained of color, a mix of disbelief and something more profound flickering in his eyes. "You should tell your sister," he said, and I imagined the tumult it could create. Was I overreacting? I didn't want to be that person who caused drama, who stirred the pot, but the thought of seeing my Bill again, of pretending everything was normal while I carried that secret, felt unbearable. So, after a restless night plagued with guilt, I took a leap. I found my sister in the kitchen, her back turned to me, music softly playing, and I told her the truth, my voice trembling, heart racing, waiting for that inevitable fallout. The recognition that sparked in her eyes was worse than I expected. She crossed her arms, her body rigid, and demanded I didn't play games, that I was out of line for trying to ruin their relationship over something so trivial. My stomach dropped, the betrayal slashed deep, and still, I pressed on, but it felt as though I was drowning in her disbelief. "He would never say that," she yelled, disbelief spilling out like venom, and before I could piece together a defense, my Bill stepped in from the hallway, his smug demeanor reeking of knowing something I didn't. In that moment, I felt trapped. I was the villain for sharing a secret, while he was framed as the innocent bystander, charming, disarming with that smile that had once felt welcoming, now twisted and sinister. More drama erupted like a storm, as James finally snapped, defending me with veracity, calling out my sister's blindness and my Bill's insidious nature. It felt like watching the world unravel, colors bleeding into chaos, accusations flying, and amidst it all, I stood there a fragile vessel of truth as my sister's heart shattered against the reality of her husband's hidden face. Suddenly, the tension escalated, voices booming off the walls, and in the commotion, my Bill attempted to save face, masking his discomfort with arrogance, backpedaling, and making excuses, but every denial fell flat around us, and the room felt as though it was crumbling, like we were standing on shaky ground. The aftermath of that confrontation shattered everything I knew. My sister no longer looked at me the same. Family gatherings were filled with awkwardness, stolen glances, and heavy silences, with my Bill always lurking, never quite able to meet my eyes, a specter of guilt hanging between my sister and me like a suffocating fog. The cold truth gnawed at my gut. I had been right to speak up, yet I felt you could also argue I had been wrong for tearing my sister's life apart. Days turned to weeks, and I began to notice the cracks in their marriage, the late nights, the whispered conversations, and my sister's phone buzzing incessantly, her face paling at every ding. She had started to pull away, and I couldn't tell if what I did was protecting her or sealing her doom. One night, I received a frantic call from James. My Bill was in a car accident, the extent of his injuries unknown, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I thought of how everything had unraveled, how the accusation had peeled away layers of our family, each peeled section exposing scars that were better left hidden. My sister arrived at the hospital, her eyes red, her heart clenching in fear and uncertainty, and I felt a pang of remorse twist in my chest. Despite the pain he caused, seeing her like this made me question everything all over again. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but the silence spoke volumes. When they wheeled him in, bruised and battered, the sharp sting of regret was almost unbearable as she rushed to his side, whispering sweet nothings that felt like hollow echoes in the sterile room. I turned away, leaving them to their moment of twisted fate, my heart heavy with the weight of choices made under duress. Watching them reconcile, I felt like a voyeur to a world that now had to navigate treachery disguised as love, and in that waiting room, surrounded by facades of support, I realized the true horror of it all. Was I the villain for sharing a secret that should have never been mine to carry, or was I just a wronged sister bearing the burden of truth in a world filled with dark secrets that fester in silence like a malignancy? As I stepped into the dark of the night, the stars seeming to mock me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real horror wasn't just what my bill said, but what love could endure. Every Thanksgiving, I felt obligated to attend my aunt's annual dinner, a tradition that started before I was even born, but this year felt different, almost oppressive. It was a routine gathering embellished with family feuds and stories of past mischief, but a thick air of something ominous clung to the dining room. As we sat down, the scent of roasted turkey mingled with something disconcertingly sour, a smell I could not quite place. My eyes landed on the side dish Aunt Helen had brought, a massive casserole of what she called Thanksgiving surprise. Something about its texture, the way it glistened under the dining room lights, made my stomach churn. It looked almost like it had been reheated, the edges crisped just enough to hint it might have spent more than a few days in her fridge, or maybe worse, her basement. It wouldn't be the first time I had suspicions about Aunt Helen's cooking. Last year, I remembered swallowing dry turkey while she told me about her magic spice she sprinkled in everything, but nothing that magical came to mind when I examined her last-minute concoction. She caught me looking, her eyes narrowing, and suddenly a wave of guilt washed over me. "You're not going to try my special dish?" she asked. The way she said it felt almost like a challenge, and I felt trapped in the moment, everyone staring expectantly, utensils poised, ready to dive into their plates like eager wolves. I hesitated, a million thoughts colliding in my mind, the family outcast for not trying Aunt Helen's cooking versus potential illness. Instead of answering, I politely said, "I'm full." My lie hung in the air like the sweet potato casserole quietly baking in the oven, and for a moment, you could feel a collective shift in the atmosphere, a tightening of bonds that were already fraying, an unseen weight pressing down on us all. Aunt Helen laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh, it echoed strangely in the room, tinged with something unsettling. "Oh, sweetie, there's always room for family," she insisted as she scooped a heaping spoonful onto my plate anyway. I could feel my face flush, the need to say no battled by the pressure of familial obligation. My heart raced as I pushed the plate away, a plea to my mom for help dancing in my eyes. She merely shrugged, seemingly lost in her own food coma, and Aunt Helen's vibe shifted to something predatory. I was suddenly acutely aware that I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her cooking, the dish itself looking far too stale, too out of place, and an echo of horror rose up within me. She had a reputation for experimenting, especially with her more unconventional recipes. Trusting my instincts, I politely declined once more, repeating my mantra about being full, yet Aunt Helen leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "You know you can't not eat it. It's special, like our family." A chill ran down my spine, a clear implication that unwillingness wasn't merely an option. My plate, sitting there, so innocently menacing, suddenly became a focal point of dread, and I could feel the eyes of my relatives on me, their longing to see tradition upheld clashing with my rising panic. The moment stretched on indefinitely, Aunt Helen's expression morphing from a faux sweet smile to something that sent a tremor through my spirit, a frown laced with unyielding expectation and a hint of malice. Somewhere deep inside, I felt her frustration swirling like a storm, and I suddenly remembered stories, whispers, that Aunt Helen had experimented with unusual ingredients before, substances that could only be described as unique, maybe even dangerous. In a moment of clarity, I could imagine the casserole magically becoming the centerpiece of her questionable culinary adventures. Perhaps she had unearthed a recipe passed down through the generations, one made with something far too bizarre to be served at a standard family gathering. My stomach turned again as the fear bubbled over. I couldn't shake the image of her examining her creation in her dimly lit kitchen, the sounds of her cackling laughter dancing with the phantom memories of the dishes I had once consumed, turning sour and abandoned long before Thanksgiving. The tension broke only when my cousin Joey made a joke that landed flat, but the deflection only caused Aunt Helen to fissure. The silence grew loud and thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions until she snapped, "You'll eat it. It's not Thanksgiving without my special dish." With each insistence, I could feel the pull of tradition choking me like a stranglehold, gnawing at my resolve, pipes of familial loyalty clinging to me as if refusing to let go. I felt the eyes of relatives proclaiming judgment, silently questioning if I would survive another year without indulging Aunt Helen's craving for pressuring me to devour it. One bite, I convinced myself, just one. Finally, I mustered some courage, my hand trembling as it reached for the serving spoon, and then I froze, caught mid-movement, my imagination racing ahead, scripting the silent horror play of what could happen if I surrendered, for what if the dish was made of despair? What if I, too, fell prey to the ancient recipe, consumed by whatever vile secrets lay within? Aunt Helen, I just can't, I finally stammered, glimpsing the anger surging in her eyes before I reluctantly blurted out the truths I had bottled up. I can't eat things that have been sitting around. What if it's bad? The room went deathly quiet, tension crackling like electric current. Aunt Helen's face morphed from frustration to an eerie calm, a chilling smile stretching across her features. "Oh, sweetie," she cooed, and I think I detected a touch of satisfaction beneath that sugar-coated voice. "You have no idea what's good for you, do you? This recipe is an heirloom passed down through generations, a commitment of love and sacrifice." In my gut, dread swirled with pure terror as the world fell away, Aunt Helen morphing into an almost fiendish apparition desperate for me to partake in her eerie legacy. The air surrounded me felt apparent with sinister undertone, and every muscle in my body screamed to get away from that table as I heard the whispers of cousins muttering behind me, "Are you really going to challenge her? Family comes first." Just as I opened my mouth to scream, the lights flickered, and a horrible realization washed over me. They all seemed to be bound to this sick ritual, a cycle fueled by hidden secrets and untold sacrifices. Then Aunt Helen continued, her voice low and almost seductive, "You think we're all just here for the food, don't you? But it's the dish that binds us, keeps our family together through everything, including those who, let's say, didn't make it to the end of the feast last year." A cold shiver crawled up my spine, and a sickening clarity washed over me, a dark understanding fretting at my sanity as I envisioned an empty chair at the table, last year's dinner where a cousin had simply vanished. Was it possible that something more sinister was cooking beneath that surface? The thought propelled me to my feet, my stomach rebelling against me in scathing protest. "I can't," I screeched, the words pouring out of me like molten lava. "I refuse." I bolted for the door as Aunt Helen's chilling laughter echoed behind me, a sound I was convinced would haunt me forever. I rushed outside, my breath leaving me in sharp gasps and my mind racing, picturing the plate of Thanksgiving surprise, the voiceless screams it held, the lingering stench of something rotten that tainted not just the casserole but maybe everything about our family. I knew, without a doubt, that I couldn't turn back, couldn't be ensnared in whatever dark web Aunt Helen had woven, and I'd sooner fast until Christmas than find out just how far she would go to preserve her twisted legacy. I stumbled into the night, knowing I would be the family outcast in their eyes, but anything was better than feasting on the horrors of last year. As the darkness closed in around me, a thrill of freedom coursed through my veins, and yet, a lingering question remained, would I be the one uninvited next year, or would the casserole have its appetite satisfied before another Thanksgiving crept upon us? I never thought my life would take the turn it did that fateful evening when I decided to clear out our daughter's bedroom. I stood in the doorway, heart racing, staring at the colorful walls plastered with unicorn stickers that she loved so much, a room frozen in her laughter and brightness, but now haunted by my husband's betrayal, a betrayal I had stumbled upon just weeks before, his late-night texts, his reckless disregard for our family, and the undeniable evidence of an affair that birthed a child they never intended for me to know. But I knew everything. Still, those long sleepless nights consisted of perfecting my revenge, and the twisted sense of justice motivated me to pack up her life as if I was merely returning a borrowed possession to a long-lost friend. I remembered the day she was born, how I had cradled her tiny body in my arms, promising her eternal love and protection, and suddenly, I felt this primal urge to shield her from the disgrace of her father's actions, and so that night, I made the trek to the attic and retrieved the boxes marked with her name, stuffed animals, art supplies, those crayon-drawn pictures that once adorned our fridge, items that brought joy now felt like reminders of her father's betrayal. I marched to her room, emptying shelves, packing them meticulously, as if with every toy I stuffed into the box I could erase the memories of his infidelity, feelings of rage coursing through my veins as I imagined his other child, the one from the affair, unpacking her things in my sacred space, living a life in our home where my daughter's spirit once thrived. How dare he think he could bring that child into our world as though nothing had changed? I loaded my car with the boxes that night, my heart pounding, the weight of my decision clinging to my chest. The thought of her father coming home to find nothing but stark walls staring back at him was too delicious to resist. I drove to my parents' house, a place where I had grown up, their cozy warmth suffocating me in nostalgia as I lugged in the boxes, determined to secure a part of my daughter's happiness where no one could touch it, wrapping it in the safe confines of love, and calling my parents to let them know the crazy plan I was enacting. They were concerned but ultimately supportive, especially after hearing the tremor of betrayal in my voice, the elements of sadness seeping through the cracks of my resolve. The weeks that followed were restless, amplifying my anxiety when I finally decided to confront him. His apologies rang hollow as he described how life just happened, and the words tore through me, shattered glass echoing in the vacant spaces of my heart. I could feel the cracks form as he pleaded with me to just give everything a second chance, to welcome him back into my arms and our daughter's life, an opportunity I knew I could never grant. Instead, I threw the boxes down around him, each one thudding against the floor with the weight of our broken dreams, hexing him with my furious stare. I told him I'd already done the heavy lifting. He would have nothing left of her, nothing left of peace for the child that had stolen my life. He gasped, his face morphing into disbelief, anger bubbling within those hazel eyes I once loved. But I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as I hung up the phone after declaring it was done, a calm overtaking me as I drove back to my parents' place to tuck my daughter into bed. And the next day, I received a call that turned my world further upside down. A mixture of disdain and pity filled my stomach as I learned about his plans to contest the arrangement, claiming that I was being unreasonable, uprooting her life further into chaos, twisting my act as malice rather than a mother's attempt to protect the sanctity that remained of our family. A loaded gun and a duel awaited. The stakes were high as whispers of the affair child began surfacing. Drama unfolding in circles I never intended to find myself in, my small town filled with scrutiny and judgment as I became the center of attention. The child was so innocent, I understood, but the way my husband was telling the story twisted everything about who I was. I was the villain now, the sinner who sought revenge on a child who knew nothing, and yet, I was right. It was an emotional roller coaster that left my heart wearied and precariously balanced as I battled courts for custody, justified my choices in front of their distorted glares, and braced for the war that would ensue when the affair child's mother decided to step forward, her blood-curdling screams echoing in the depths of my mind when she confronted me about taking their belongings, accusing me of silently cruel intentions as if I was the one who betrayed, as if I pulled the trigger first. It was easy to hate her as she bounced behind the emotions of being denied happiness, as I reminded myself she chose this life, while I had committed to ours. But things began to change when I heard my daughter whisper hauntedly through the air while she played with friends, "Is my room still there?" Maybe the futility of my actions were now painful in ways I hadn't anticipated as I realized I wasn't only uprooting my husband and the child he sired, but I was silently ripping apart my little girl's foundation, and that thought dug in. So a week passed, and I stood at my former home, staring at the pallid door, and my heart cracked open even wider. I bellowed open the front door, the darkness of the hallway overwhelmed me, and there it was, that echo of laughter carried down the walls, but no longer were they filled with her joy. My heart raced as I ventured past the living room to vanish into my daughter's realm of colors, and in that instant, I felt like a ghost. The furniture moved around so starkly it was as if I could feel nothing but despair seeping through the cracks, and what awaited was a mere glimpse of those toys that I had left behind. They remained discarded, callously tossed without care, and the sheer thought of my daughter being replaced by a child who should have never existed in this place stirred something inside me. It hit me then. I wasn't making a point, I was simply hurting an innocent. I never thought a simple question could unravel everything, but there I was, standing in the break room of my office, the scent of stale coffee and artificial lemon air freshener filling my lungs, when I turned to the pregnant woman beside me, Lisa, bright-eyed and vibrant even at 8 months along, and asked if she had decided whether she was having a boy or a girl. The moment the words left my lips, I felt an icy chill grip the air. Lisa's smile faltered, her eyes darting to the corner of the room as if she were searching for an escape, and I sensed something was off. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe she was just tired, but it was the awkward silence that followed that began to gnaw at my insides. Later that day, I heard whispers between coworkers, hushed tones discussing how Lisa had been acting strangely ever since I asked my innocent question, and for the first time, I wondered if I had crossed some invisible line. It was then that Jake, who sat 2 desks down, casually mentioned that Lisa had always been a bit superstitious about her pregnancy. She refused to know the gender or even discuss it, holding on to some kind of family belief that speaking it out loud would change the fate of the unborn child. I laughed off the comment, dismissing it as one of the workplace jokes he often liked to offer, but a seed of doubt was planted, and curiosity twisted my gut. A week passed, and Lisa's behavior became more and more erratic. One day she seemed fine, the next she was withdrawn, and rumors of her frequent trips to the restroom made their rounds, a silent testimony to the stress bubbling beneath the surface. I started to feel like I was the unwitting villain in a drama that I had no intention of starring in. On a particularly charged day, I decided it was time to confront the issue, a kind of reconciliation, perhaps. I approached her in that same break room, where we had shared laughs over coffee before her pregnancy became the only topic that seemed to matter. "Hey, Lisa," I said, trying to keep my tone light, "I didn't mean to upset you. I genuinely just wanted to know your baby's gender." She turned to me, her expression unreadable, and grounded her coffee cup in her hands so tightly I thought she might crush it. "You really don't understand, do you?" Her voice was low, almost trembling, and the weight of her gaze bore into me with all the intensity of an unexplainable fear. I shrugged, my stomach twisting again, and she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper, "It's not about the baby, it's about the curse." A chill swept through me. "Curse?" I asked, half laughing, playing it off as more of a nervous impulse. But Lisa was dead serious. She spoke of her family's tradition, a long-standing belief that asking about the baby's gender would unleash an ancient entity, something she referred to as the unknowing, that thrived on secrets and manipulated destinies, insisting that it was not a mere fable but something that had affected her family for generations. Every woman before her who revealed the gender of their child had met with tragic outcomes, she warned, their lives spiraling into chaos soon after. I scoffed, trying to inject humor because that's what I did to mask my discomfort, but Lisa's eyes were wide, pleading. The color drained from my face as her story unraveled, tales of eerie coincidences and tragedies that befell those who broke the silence. I left the break room feeling a heaviness in my chest, questioning everything I thought was merely casual workplace banter. That evening, unable to shake her words, I went home to do research, swept up in stories of expectant mothers and inexplicable fates. Each story was darker than the last, and I couldn't help but feel a pressure building inside my mind, as if the very act of having asked about her baby had cracked open a door to something sinister. That night, I dreamt of Lisa's face, distorted with fear as shadows writhed in corners, whispering unspeakable secrets. The next day, I approached her again, nervously spewing apologies and assurances that I wouldn't mention it again, but when she looked at me, the fire had dimmed, she was a shell of the vibrant woman I had first known. "It's too late," she said softly, and my heart missed a beat. "You can't take it back now." My stomach dropped. I wanted to ask what she meant, but a part of me feared unraveling that thread even further. Over the following days, I watched her grow more and more withdrawn. Unbeknownst to her, I felt an inexplicable connection to her turmoil, as if I had unintentionally entered a contract, a sinister arrangement without any form of consent. Each day, a cloud of dread loomed in the office. Serial events of misfortune began to plague not just Lisa, but our entire workplace: minor accidents, inexplicable illnesses, disruptions during meetings that seemed part of a stretch of macabre coincidences. Jake suffered an unfortunate slip on a spilled drink, sending an entire tray of coffee crashing onto the floor, while another colleague got into a freak accident involving a printer explosion that sent him to the ER. I began receiving ominous texts from an unknown number that taunted, "What have you done?" The message sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel the tension rising, thick enough to choke on, and I blamed myself for unleashing whatever malevolent force was at play. I could hardly concentrate, my mind racing to the moment I had uttered that question. It had turned into a nightmare loop festering in my brain, spiraling further until I reached the precipice of insanity. Louise, once a vibrant presence in our office, was nowhere to be found. Her desk remained untouched, an eerie ghost of her former self. In a moment of desperation, I reached out to her, sending texts and emails, each correspondences laden with apology, shame, and fear, but never got a response. Then one late evening, as I was the last person in the office, working late to avoid the silence of my own home, I heard a commotion from the break room, whispers wove in and out, almost caressing my ears, mixed with the sound of a soft cry. My heart raced, curiosity battled against dread, and against my better judgment, I crept towards the sound. Peering through the doorway, I froze. The lights flickered erratically, casting shadows that danced chaotically on the wall, and there stood Lisa, her features twisted in anguish, bathed in the eerie glow of fluorescent lights, a group of shadows encircling her, their faces shrouded in darkness. It was as if she were embroiled in some arcane ritual, and in that surreal moment, I felt both an overwhelming desire to run and an inexplicable urge to step forward to save her from whatever nightmare was unfolding. But the moment I took a step forward, they turned toward me, and the breath caught in my throat as every face transformed into a grotesque visage of laughter and grief, mouths forming words that spilled poison into the air. "You meddled, you asked, and now it's too late." I staggered back, horror seeping into my veins as the dim light faded, plunging the room into darkness, swallowing screams, swallowing everything whole, until I found myself running for the door, bursting out into the night, the cries echoing behind me. Days have passed, and yet the question still haunts me. Was I AITA for asking my pregnant colleague if she was having a boy or a girl? I didn't want to believe the stories, to think there was any truth in her fears, but something in me knows the shadows linger, that the unknowing watches. Lisa is gone, and the office is forever changed, shadows creeping across every desk, every hallway, and I cannot shake the sense that in asking that insipid question, I unleashed something meant to remain buried. Now every night, as the weight of silence envelops my home, I hear the whispers echoing outside my window, taunting me, and I know it was my curiosity that opened the door, and perhaps it was my life they were waiting to claim next. I never thought attending my aunt's baby shower would lead to the kind of nightmare I could barely comprehend, but looking back, the entire day felt like a slow-motion train wreck that I could do nothing to stop. The moment I stepped into her lavishly decorated living room, filled with pastel-colored balloons and annoyingly cute decorations, a sense of dread washed over me. My aunt, who had always been the fun relative, was now the center of attention for her impending motherhood, and I was just a reluctant guest somewhat dragged into it by family obligations. As we congregated in a circle, playing those absurd games no one genuinely enjoyed, I felt the weight of the pressure to put on a smile, pretend I cared, and above all, be respectful, even though I knew I had no intention of doing so. You see, I had secretly vowed not to attend if the invitation didn't specifically ask for me. In essence, it was a pity invite, and I wasn't about to humor her for the sake of appearances. She could hardly keep her enthusiasm in check as she opened gifts, which only added fuel to my frustration. As she unwrapped yet another onesie garnished with cartoon elephants, the urge to unleash my disdain boiled inside me, colliding with the social facade I was trying to uphold. That's when my cousin's judgmental gaze caught mine. It was one of those looks that said, "Are you really going to spoil this?" And in that moment, I snapped. Without thinking, I blurted, "You should have picked a different theme, Aunt Linda, this one just screams desperately trying to cope with reality." The room fell silent. I could almost hear the collective intake of breath, the awkward shifting of chairs. Aunt Linda's smile faltered, her hands froze midair, cradling a pastel gift bag, what I now realized was a colossal faux pas on my part that I could never take back. I thought I might hear laughter, perhaps even a sarcastic comment to lighten the mood, but it was only my heart pounding in my ears as embarrassment washed over her and me in equal measure. She tried to laugh it off, a strange sound that only added to the tension, but the damage was done. Cousins exchanged glances, probably wondering what kind of monster they had in their family. As the clock ticked by, so did my humiliation, morphing into something darker. I could sense my aunt's dwindling excitement, like a balloon slowly deflating, and suddenly the quaint surroundings felt sinister, as if the pastel decorations were laughing at me. The whispers began, not just about my comment but about my intentions. I was somehow branded the villain of the day, the one who could not tolerate the simple joy of family. And then, the lights flickered, subtle at first, like a knowing wink, but with each passing moment, they gradually dimmed further until it felt like the room had shifted entirely. I could hear the sound of muffled conversations echoing around the walls, each echoed word dripping with disdain towards me even as more presents were opened, but what really unnerved me was the realization that with each present emptied of its novelty, my aunt seemed to grow smaller, lost beneath the heaps of expectation. As cupcakes were served, I could taste the bitterness of my own words lingering on my tongue, and the silence thickened as if we were all trapped in a bubble too surreal to puncture. Unable to bear the atmosphere any longer, I left the room, mumbling something about needing water, but what I found was unexpectedly horrifying. The hallway was dark, and my own shadow felt cloaked in a fog, twisting in ways that threatened to swallow me whole. Glancing back, I caught sight of Aunt Linda, who stood silhouetted in the doorway, a chilling stillness radiating from her. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift behind her, something not quite right, a swirling darkness that lurked at the edges of the light, whispering secrets I dared not grasp. I wanted to retreat, but my legs wouldn't move as curiosity and fear wrestled within me. Just as I mustered the courage to step closer, the air thickened around me, and I heard a faint melody, almost like a lullaby, that filled the space with weight and melancholy. The kind of song that might soothe an infant while sending shivers up the spines of grown adults. And then in that eerie calm, Aunt Linda turned, and I swear I saw something flicker across her face, a shadow of anger or perhaps disappointment so profound that I understood, in that moment, it was something far deeper than the trivial squabble we just had. I would later wish I had turned back when the last guest left, because the darkness that followed me into the living room wasn't just an absence of light, it enveloped me in a fear I couldn't fully articulate. I could barely follow the stifled conversation as my relatives buzzed about gifts and game scores. A soft sob reached my ears from where Aunt Linda stood, and in that instant of realization, I understood that the baby shower was not merely a celebration, but a last-ditch effort for her sanity amidst the growing anticipation, the kind that had swallowed her long before I opened my mouth. When I finally returned home, exhausted and filled with regret, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in Aunt Linda's house had wrapped around her like a stalker, that they were now straining to break free, dragging her down into a world that would never be the same again. And soon, I had to face the truth. Sometimes, an unfiltered moment of honesty could unravel something fragile, something unwanted, leaving me wondering just how far I had crossed the line of being the family embarrassment, and if I might have awakened something darker within her that no one else would have to confront but me. Days passed into weeks, and every time my phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Linda, I hesitated, knowing that the silence between us had morphed into a chasm too wide to bridge. I'd come to realize that perhaps my failure to exhibit tact was not purely about a single moment, but about something profound. Her descent after the shower had spiraled into a silence filled with shadows that felt tragically suffocating. And while I should have reached out with an apology, I remained sequestered in my own turmoil, fearing that each unreturned message was a dagger aimed at the heart of my conscience, pushing me deeper into the abyss of guilt. Little did I know that guilt would soon transform into dread as vague whispers tainted the air around me, and the creeping sense that I had not just embarrassed my aunt but set something free snaked through the cracks of my reality like a shattering dreamscape. And in that unsettling blend of right and wrong, I found myself asking the haunting question that wouldn't let me go. Was I really the villain in this story, or had I merely opened a door that should have remained shut? I never thought I'd be the one to ruin the holidays, but I guess that's what happens when your family decides you're the villain. It all started when Mom began to forget things, small things at first, like where she placed her knitting needles, but soon it escalated to missing important appointments and repeating stories just minutes apart. By the time the doctors finally agreed it was Alzheimer's, we were already deep into the annual holiday preparations, every single corner of the house smelling like cinnamon and pine, a stark contrast to the dread that settled in my stomach. My siblings and I had been discussing Mom's care for months, but every time we brought it up, Dad would brush us off, insisting she was just going through a phase. So, there we stood at the kitchen table that year, stuffing our faces with sugar cookies, debating the reality in front of us while Dad played Christmas music a little too loud to ignore the seriousness of the conversation. We finally decided it was time to take action. My sister and I felt like we had no choice but to push Dad to consider a long-term care facility, a decision that would forever alter the dynamics of our family. After weeks of pushing and arguing, we managed to find a place, one that seemed warm and welcoming, tucked away near a lovely, serene park. I'll never forget the look on Mom's face the day I took her there. It was a mix of confusion and unease, like she was suddenly stuck in a world unfamiliar to her. Sure, there were moments that broke my heart, when I heard her mumble under her breath about wanting to go home, or the way her hands trembled as she reached out for mine while we were walking through the facility's garden. Still, I convinced myself that it was the best decision for her. I didn't realize how my family would react until the holidays arrived. We gathered around the dinner table, laughter bouncing off the walls like the spirited carols playing in the background, but every joke fell flat when someone brought up Mom being in the facility. The looks exchanged, disapproving, hurt, cut deeper than any knife could. "You had to put her in there, huh?" My brother scoffed, mimicking the tone of someone relaying gossip, making a joke out of something that felt raw and broken. I asked him how he thought we could keep up with her needs when we could barely manage our own lives, and in response, he slammed his fist on the table, sending a glass of wine flying off the edge for it to shatter against the floor, the sound echoing in my ears like a tolling bell. Christmas night turned into a disaster. Dad left the table early, mumbling something about being sick, and my brother followed him, grumbling about how things used to be. My sister sat there, seemingly unaffected, but I could see the tears threatening to spill. I felt like I had placed a rift in our family's foundation, and it was my fault. By the time the clock struck midnight, I was alone in the kitchen, scrubbing the remnants of that holiday meal, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. It was surreal watching myself shift from a devoted daughter into some distorted version attacking her own flesh and blood. That's when I heard it, soft, muffled whispers drifting from the living room where my family was gathered. Curiosity piqued, I leaned against the wall, straining to hear their words as well as the melancholy sound of the music filtering through the air. "I miss Mom, she was the glue," my sister said, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't the way it's supposed to be." I stood frozen, panic swelling inside until I couldn't suppress it any longer. I was about to turn away when I heard my brother's voice, low and menacing, cutting through the sorrow. "She wrecked Christmas. We'll never forgive her." His words stung, and the darkness began to swell, an ugly, gnawing sensation crawling along my spine. For weeks after, all I heard from my siblings were passive-aggressive remarks about how I was to blame. They'd thrown holiday gatherings minus me, told stories that excluded any mention of Mom's current state, effectively rewriting history to make it look as though I wasn't even a part of this family anymore. I could have handled that, dealt with their hostility, but what I couldn't prepare for was that one icy January night a blizzard hit, forcing them to call me. Mom had fallen and needed to be rushed to the hospital. I couldn't breathe as I drove through the blinding snow, my heart racing faster than my car skidding across the icy roads. Arriving at the hospital, I was met with a wall of tension. My brother stood at the entrance, shoved his hands deep into his pockets, avoiding any eye contact, while my sister's eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, the stress and guilt weighing down on all of us. When the doctor finally emerged with a grim expression, it became painfully clear, I'd made the worst decision of my life. Mom had pneumonia. The long-term care facility had been negligent, failing to monitor her properly, allowing her state to worsen while we sat at home, too caught up in our family drama to notice. Standing in the stark waiting room, all the blame came crashing down on me like an avalanche. I was the villain in this warped version of our holiday story, and now, I held the key to her life in my hands. Days stretched into an eternity, and every minute was filled with tension. My siblings and I watched her fight for breath, whispering stories of how she used to bake cornbread on chilly afternoons or read us bedtime stories until we nodded off, hoping that somehow reaching into a happy past might bring back the woman we loved. Then, in a moment that felt both exhilarating and terrifying, her eyes opened briefly, and for a fleeting second, I swear I saw the spark of recognition, a glimmer of the warm, loving Mom I had known slowly fading. But just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, her breath becoming shallow as our family crumbled around her. A few weeks later, Mom was discharged, but she was not the same, lost in a fog of confusion and fear, like a wisp of smoke dissolving into the air. We decided to take her home, feeling that maybe familiarity would assist her recovery. As we settled into a grim routine, the guilt twisted deeper, roughening our laughter, suffocating our joy, and turning family moments into reminders of what we lost that fateful day I made an impossible choice. If anything good emerged from our turmoil, it was that my siblings and I finally united under an unspoken oath to never let the past repeat itself. We'd always check in on one another, foregoing the blame and the name-calling in the spirit of family. Yet the shadow of that holiday still hung over me, unrelenting and bitter, a chilling reminder of how a seemingly small decision, placing my mom in a facility, had led to our family's unraveling. We may not fully understand our roles in the eulogy of what once was, but I know one thing for certain: the holidays became unbearable, each year a haunting reminder of lost moments, with our lingering guilt festering into a dangerous concoction of shared grief and blame that can either bind us together or tear us apart all over again. So now, as I sit here, secretly shaking and desperately holding on to the hope that we can find a way back to some semblance of love and happiness, I question, am I the asshole for wanting to reclaim my family during this holiday season, or am I just a prisoner to my own mistakes, forever banished from the warmth that was once our reality? I never thought refusing to babysit my niece would lead to such a haunting series of events, but here I am, fingers trembling over my keyboard, desperate to share what transpired. It all began with a simple family gathering, my heart warm from the laughter and the clinking of glasses, until my sister, Lily, confronted me. She didn't care for the way I brought my boyfriend, Jake, around. She said it was inappropriate, like a circus show crashing into a serene family picnic. I was blindsided, and feeling cornered, I snapped, telling her that I wouldn't stand for her judgmental attitude and her constant need to control who I bring into our family's space. She retaliated by demanding I babysit her kids that weekend, as if promising to take care of her children hinged on my compliance. I returned home in a rage, refusing to justify myself further. A cloud of tension hung over my mind, but I convinced myself it was just typical family drama and that things would blow over. However, that very night, I received a call from my brother-in-law, frantic and nearly incoherent. He said something had happened, that the kids weren't behaving, and Lily was off the deep end. Wordlessly, I felt the shadow of dread creep in. It turned out he was wrong. Lily had taken the kids to a local fair, and when she didn't come back, well, the phone calls began flooding in. Hours stretched into what felt like an eternity, my stomach knotting more tightly with each unanswered ring, until they found her car abandoned in the parking lot, the engine still warm, and the haunting echoes of laughter from the carnival turned into sirens and chaos. It was only after frantic searches that they found her 3 blocks away, screaming at the top of her lungs, but not for help. She was screaming at her kids, who stood there, petrified with wide eyes and trembling limbs. The problem? She claimed she had seen something dark and lurking, something that she insisted was trying to get them. It wasn't just a skit, it was real to her. The way she talked about it, like it was a relentless predator stalking the shadows, had everyone on edge. It landed her in a psychiatrist's office, the official diagnosis being acute stress reaction. She could no longer care for her kids without assistance, and that's when the guilt hit me like a freight train. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I should have just sucked it up and done my part while juggling my own feelings about Jake. Instead, I'd stood my ground like some stubborn rock while she spiraled into the unknown. It didn't help that the kids became more withdrawn. They wouldn't speak about the fair or even look me in the eye anymore. So, feeling responsible, I offered to step in on weekend babysitting duties to support her recovery, but the atmosphere felt heavy, thick with unfinished chords that resonated unanswered questions. I began to notice strange things happening during these sessions. The kids would stare at empty corners of the room, whispering things I couldn't hear. Their faces turned pale as if they saw memories of something wicked, and one evening, while I was trying to distract them with movies, I caught them doodling in their coloring books. One innocent scrawl read, "It saw us." I brushed it aside, chalking it up to vivid imaginations, but then I heard soft thumps coming from upstairs when nothing was up there. My heart raced. I pushed through the fear, convincing myself it was old house creaks. But when the children's laughter turned to sobs, and they refused to go near the window, I decided I needed to confront this terrifying new reality. There was a lingering chill each night, and as I'd watch the kids fall asleep, I'd scour every inch of the house trying to find traces of what had stolen their joy. Then one night, while flipping through channels with the twins snuggled under blankets, a local news report caught my attention, a witness account claiming in the area, and I swear to you, it was the exact description of what my sister had said she saw. Something with long fingers and a grotesque face that would make shadows tremble. Feeling sickened, I dismissed it as coincidence but couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me. I called Lily, her voice muffled and terrified, begging me not to let the kids go outside alone, and suddenly, everything spiraled out of my control. I thought I was doing good by stepping in, but it only worsened. The kids' nightmares turned real, and they refused to stay in their rooms, screaming about the thing in the shadows whenever night fell. I tried to reassure them, but all they could talk about was how it knew where they were and how it wanted to take them. Every night, I'd hear the soft whispering and see shadows darting past the corners of my vision. I was sleepless, frantic, and terrified. Months went by and therapy didn't help Lily, and when I finally stole a moment to lay out everything that happened to my boyfriend, Jake, he listened, shaken but resolute, telling me we'd investigate the house. The moment we walked into that living room, I caught Jake watching the children out of the corner of his eye, murmuring, "It's just an illusion." I had hoped he was right. I couldn't bear the thought of the monstrous beliefs consuming my family. So one evening, armed with only a flashlight, we ventured through the attic, but all we found were old boxes and dusty memories until an unearthly silence hung in the air. I flipped the switch, and together, we felt the temperature drop. Hardly a breath could be heard, and suddenly those whispers kicked in more clearly. In sharp clarity, I felt it wash over me, an overwhelming sense of dread cementing my feet to the floor, and Jake jerked back, his face paling as he swept the beam across the shadows. And there it was, lurking in the edges, a twisted shape standing tall, fingers stretching impossibly long towards us. I wanted to scream. My instincts yelled to run, to grab the kids and flee, but in that moment, terror froze us in time. The thing whispered a name, my sister's name, and I realized then that it had wanted her all along, wanting to drag her into its world of darkness. That's when I heard my niece's voice, soft, innocent, and oh so familiar, calling me from downstairs, begging me to come play. I snapped awake from my horror, clutching my boyfriend's arm, and somehow rushed down the stairs, screaming for the kids to get away from the windows, but the room was empty. Silence smothered me alive, and when we managed to tear ourselves outside, a suffocating realization washed over me: the children were gone. Lily, lost in her own hell, and my family fracturing from the inside out, while the shadows grew ever longer. So now I sit here, sleepless, haunted, wrapped in both guilt and unanswered questions, because the thing that took my niece, that thing that chased echoes across our lives, had started as a mere judgment at a party, spiraling into a nightmare I never wanted to be a part of. AITA for refusing to babysit when I had no clue it would unravel into a much darker unfolding? I never imagined I'd be embroiled in a battle of morality with my sister, especially not after a long day that started with the usual chaos of life with my own kids. But my phone rang in the middle of a meeting, and it was like my heart stopped when I saw her name. Sarah never calls unless it's an emergency. You need to come to the school now, she snapped, and it felt like ice water poured into my veins. What's happening? I asked, dread crawling under my skin like a swarm of ants. It's Liam. He's waiting for me, and I forgot to pick him up. In that moment, the world around me blurred, my mind replayed the image of my sweet, innocent nephew, all big brown eyes, and that shy smile, waiting all alone in a cold, unwelcoming cafeteria long after the bell had rung. I felt a surge of rage and disbelief. How could she leave him there? You put your phone on Do Not Disturb? Are you kidding me? I yelled, my voice rising in disbelief. She dismissed my concern with a wave of her hand, as if this was just a minor inconvenience. It's just a kid. He'll be fine until I get there, she responded too casually, shrugging her shoulder as if it was no big deal that her first grader was more vulnerable than a single light bulb flickering in a pitch-black room. I was enraged, imagining that little boy, staring at those doors, waiting for the only adult who he thought would pick him up, and instead, feeling the creeping realization that he'd been forgotten. My voice echoed through the phone, louder and sharper than I intended. You need to stop acting like this is acceptable behavior. What kind of person just leaves their child behind? What are you thinking? And as soon as I said it, I felt a chill run down my spine as if something sinister was watching from the shadows. I drove to the school, every nerve ending in my body aflame with anxiety, imagining all the worst-case scenarios, the cruelty of older kids, the indifference of teachers, and the emptiness of that cafeteria. When I arrived, I burst through the doors. My sister was already there, but it wasn't her face I was looking for, it was my nephew. My heart raced as I scanned the space, and then I spotted him at a corner table, head resting on crossed arms, a pathetic, lonely figure surrounded by the echoes of laughter from children who had long since reunited with their parents. Liam. I called out, my breath hitching as he looked up, his tear-stained cheeks sending a dagger through my heart. He sprinted to me, wrapping his little arms around my waist as if I were the last lifeline in a drowning sea, and I couldn't hold back my own tears. Why didn't Mommy come? He whispered, his voice thick with confusion. I couldn't answer, as rage bubbled up anew along with maternal instinct. I turned to Sarah, my voice low but fierce. How could you do this to him? But the confrontation was interrupted by the school principal, a stern gaze beneath her thick glasses. I really need to speak with you both, she said, and her tone suggested this was more than just a simple late pickup. We were ushered to her office where she would reveal a deep concern for Liam's well-being, her voice grave. We've had reports of disturbing incidents in the area lately, she said, and my blood turned to ice. Children have gone missing after school hours. My heart dropped as the implications sank in, visions of what could have happened to Liam racing through my mind like a runaway train. I looked at Sarah, her face pale as she glanced at Liam, who now stood wide-eyed, oblivious to the danger that could have befallen him. I didn't know. She finally gasped, the reality of her negligence crashing down with the weight of 1,000 boulders. Everything changed in that moment. I could see her fear reflected in Liam's face, and it was then that I understood. She wasn't just careless, she was lost in a world of her own, one that wouldn't allow her to hear the tiny voice of her son, or the muffled cries for help of countless others trapped in their phones or their own minds. The principal continued, children need their parents more than ever, especially during these times. As she explained more about the cases in the area, I felt the air grow thick around us, suffocating. I had imagined a confrontation filled with shouting and blame, but instead, we were faced with the reality that we weren't just failing ourselves but the very ones we sought to protect. My anger morphed into deep sadness, the kind that grips you and doesn't let go, leaving room only for fear. My accusations hung in the air heavy, yet silent, while all I could hear was Liam's soft breaths and the distant voices of children still laughing outside, oblivious to the darkness lurking just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. What haunted me then was the realization that perhaps, long before this incident, Sarah didn't just need me to yell. She needed me there, to guide her and Liam from whatever darkness she had fallen into, and that made me angrier than the reckless act itself. The principal's voice faded into a blur, warnings turning into echoes, while I held Liam close, swaying gently in a world now filled with shadows, not knowing if we'd ever truly be free of the hidden fears that lurk behind our screens, threatening to dissolve the fabric of our most sacred connections. How much longer could it go on like this? I'm writing this because I'm terrified, and I need to share my story before it consumes me. It all started innocently enough. My mother-in-law, Diane, was a well-meaning woman, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself in the years we spent feigning cordiality while navigating her unpredictable rages. A few weeks before her death, when she was confined to a hospital bed after a sudden heart attack, she let slip her plans for her will. We sat there, my husband and I, sipping weak coffee in that sterile waiting room, our expressions shifting from bored to tense as she rambled on about the 5 timeshares she insisted were a gift from the heart. 5 timeshares, 1 in the Bahamas, 2 in the Smoky Mountains, and 2 in Oregon, all racking up an eye-watering total of $9,500 in annual fees. We had explicitly told her we couldn't maintain such burdens, especially since we were trying to stabilize our own lives after the pandemic, but she had become a different person. In her fevered state, she grew angry, her voice rising until the monitors beeped in protest, spitting out an array of frantic notes, and as they moved to stabilize her, I felt something shift in the air. We lost her a day later, and with her went those ominous plans like a dark storm cloud hovering over us. When we gathered with the family days later to read the will, her attorney handed over a neatly typed paper outlining her loving gifts. I felt the blood drain from my face as I scanned the page, but as I looked around the room, none of my in-laws seemed to flinch. Their expressions were almost gleeful, like they were satisfied with her eccentric logic. I turned to my husband, gauging his reaction, but he was silent, a muscle twitching at his jaw. That's when I felt my gut twist. Did they know something I didn't? I brushed it off, thinking that maybe this was her outrageous way of keeping us tied to her legacy. Yet, as the days passed, keeping up with anonymous letter after letter from the timeshare companies demanding payment, I began to feel something lurking in the shadows. The first sign I noticed was at our doorstep, a heavy package wrapped in a dark, coated paper with no return address. I opened it to find an ominous leather binder embossed with an insignia I didn't recognize, a serpent intertwining with a skull, each letter ominously fading into the worn edges. Inside, an old photograph showed timeshares with figures that looked hauntingly familiar. My heart raced as I flipped through, affirmation of Diane's haunting grip still latching onto us, grinning maliciously through the ages. I felt the chill of unseen eyes, and it escalated to a weekly affliction. Every Monday, more packages arrived, and with them, an ever-deepening dread. They held strange notes, requests that revealed an unsettling trend. Each note dished out threats about some familial pact that had gone unfulfilled, with instructions no one could decipher. It claimed that we would own not only the timeshares, but also their dark histories, leading us to confront shattered memories of the past I didn't know I was connected to. My husband became a shell of who he was, slowly deteriorating under the pressure of family whispers, and it broke my heart to watch as he no longer found solace in our home. We fought more, and nights devolved into silence as we each lay awake, haunted. Then, one night while unpacking a new round of letters, I stumbled upon something even darker, a crudely drawn map with arrows leading to the bases of the timeshare properties, each one marked with an X. As I studied it, the atmosphere in the room thickened, and I could hear my husband yelling at something invisible. He was in a fit, begging for whatever dark presence to leave us alone as he drew back into that despondent spiral. I watched in horror as the glow around him dimmed. Suddenly, he wasn't himself anymore. The land where we thought we would craft memories had begun to consume us, revealing secrets that had long lingered in the shadows. We tried cutting ties, but the letters became more menacing, each threatening paragraph ushering in a new realm of despair. Then came the nightmares. They were vivid, bringing echoes of Diane standing at the edge of a storm-lashed beach, her laughter twisted and echoing as though she enjoyed watching us writhe in agony, and each night, it felt like we were being pulled into an abyss where neither of us could escape. My husband grew distant, wrapped in unfathomable darkness until one evening I woke up to find him gone. Panic set in as I searched everywhere, only to find the door ajar, leading to the open night air where the moon hung heavy. It was at that moment I realized he had become entrapped in the very thing Diane had left us, a cursed possession disguised as a gift. I ran toward the beach as fear surged through me, and at the water's edge, I caught sight of him standing there, entranced by something in the distance. I screamed, but the waves drowned me out, and by the time I reached him, his eyes were glazed over, filled with a stirring malice that raised my hair and froze my breath. It wasn't him anymore, it was something sinister wearing his skin as the ground trembled beneath me. I stumbled back, realizing that Diane's gift was more than financial, it was an unholy legacy. Now, every time a package arrives, every whisper from our family or sighting at our doorstep sends chills washing over me. I can't tell what's real anymore, and as the letters demand my husband's soul, I feel the tide rise, cleaving our fates, one letter at a time. So here I am, terrified and alone, begging for someone to believe me, drowning in the legacy she intended for us, an inheritance of which we never asked, but now it feels like we've entered an irrevocable deal with the dead, and each passing day, I fear I will wake up at the water's edge and find him gone forever, consumed by the darkness, forever tangled in the serpent's embrace. I never considered myself an overly dramatic person, but the night I sent that text to Claire felt like something snapped inside me. It wasn't just a day of frustration but the culmination of months watching my supposed best friend slip away into her endless cycle of busy with no space for the people who actually cared about her. The backstory was simple. Claire had always been the life of the party, the friend who could charm anyone into laughing, but as soon as she landed that promotion, everything changed. Texts went unanswered for days, outings were forgotten or rescheduled, and each time I reached out, her excuse felt more like an avalanche burying us further apart rather than a mountain we could climb together. After what seemed like a final straw, I shot her a message that echoed with my resentment. AITA for telling my friend she can get back in touch when she stops being perpetually busy? I put my phone down and immediately regretted my harsh words, yet part of me felt vindicated, a sense that finally, I'd said what I'd been too scared to articulate for so long. Claire's response wasn't immediate. Instead, there was a deafening silence that made me revisit all those memories we had, the laughter, the late-night talks, the promises of sticking together no matter what. Slowly, dread crept in, replaced by guilt, as I started to wonder if I'd really lost her for good. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day my initial fury waned into a dull ache of longing, until one night, I was awoken from a fitful sleep by a sudden vibration from my phone, my heart racing as I saw Claire's name on the screen. But when I opened her message, dread fueled the rush of blood to my face. She was apologizing, but not like I hoped. Claire hinted at her busy life, but there was something heavier, almost ominous in the words. "You don't understand," she wrote, followed by a string of excuses that could have been relatable if not for that unshakable feeling clawing at my mind, a chill that whispered that it was more than just a busy schedule. Ignoring the pull in my gut, I pushed back. I told her to stop the excuses and pushed her for the truth about what had really changed. A bad idea, I guess. I should have let it go, let her come back when she was able to face me again instead of poking through her life like a curious child, because that only escalated the tension between us. In my next message, I asked pointedly, "What does busy really mean for you?" And with that second text sent, it felt like a match struck in a dark room. Her silence morphed into something heavier than I could have anticipated. Suddenly, weeks became a winding path of vague acknowledgments and exchanges tinged with tension until she finally agreed to meet. When we did meet, she looked different, like an entire universe had passed between us. Her eyes were shadowed, cheeks sunken, and her words trembled with a weight I couldn't comprehend. As we sat in the dimly lit cafe, every small, Talk fell flat. All I could think of was that the light in her had dimmed, almost as if all the joy I knew was trapped somewhere in her busy life, so I desperately grasped for answers, and when I asked her point blank what had really happened, her fingers went still, the air thickened, and her eyes darted around before whispering a confession that sent ice through my veins. "It's not just my job," she said, her voice trembling. "You're not the only one feeling left behind," and when she took a deep breath, I held back tears, bracing for a horror that her words carried, a revelation of how deeply the busy facade had become a shield for something darker. She spoke of a man she didn't know anymore, of late-night calls that turned sinister, and friends whose busy lives were mere distractions from deeper problems, of her struggles and the friends replaced by shadows, until the connection hit harder than a punch. I was losing her, slipping away into a world I couldn't reach. Before I could respond, Claire's face drained of color, and she shot a glance toward the door, chilled by the sudden urgency in her eyes. I turned just in time to see a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the threshold of the cafe, a silhouette with a familiar air that sent chills down my spine. I tried to ignore the rising panic, but Claire's reaction was telling. She jumped to her feet, gripping my arm. "We have to go, now," she urged, and the desperation in her voice sent my heart racing. We bolted out into the streets, and as her shaky hands held the door open, I felt that something was hunting us, a relentless specter lurking in the shadows of our conversations, waiting to pull Claire back into whatever darkness stalked her. We spent the next few hours zigzagging through back alleys, weaving in and out of shops until finally, we collapsed into a cramped diner, both gasping for breath. As we sat there, the weight of unspoken secrets loomed over us like a storm, and while I tried desperately to convince her to share the stories that gnawed at her, the look in her eyes told me more than words could. She was scared, not just of whatever hunted her, but of revealing the truth that had been clawing at her for so long. It was in that moment I realized the gravity of my message. This busy life of hers was more than just a job, it was a barrier, a desperate attempt to keep the shadows at bay. I made a silent promise to myself, a promise to break through the fear that bound her even if it meant confronting the darkness head-on. But the night didn't end there, and right as we decided to head out, wrapped in our resolve, there it was again, the distant hum of bad energy, a sense of ice stalking us just out of sight. Our instincts kicked in, fears bubbling to the surface, culminating in an unspoken understanding that, whatever passed between us was not finished. And as we ducked and weaved through the darkness, I felt the familiar weight of haunting echoes, every unanswered message, every ignored call, every vicious cycle. It all came crashing down. Claire had been drowning this entire time, and I had been blind.